Chapter 1. Fan Shen struggled to keep his eyelids open. He looked at his fingers and counted the meaningful things he had done in his life. He hadn't even finished counting his 5 fingers, which were as thin as chopsticks, when he sighed and sadly gave up on the task. The smell of medicine in the ward was always so pungent. The old man on the bed next to him had already reported to Xidigarba 2 days ago. It would probably be his turn in a few days. He had some kind of strange disease, myasthenia gravis. It was the kind of disease that was especially suitable for male protagonists in romance novels. It was said that if there was no cure, he wouldn't be able to move anything except for his tears when he died. But I'm not a male protagonist in a romance novel, Fan Shen mumbled, but because the muscles in his jaw were useless, it became a string of muffled murmurs. He looked at his middle finger and felt sorry for himself. I'm still a virgin. He really hadn't done anything meaningful in his life, other than helping an old lady cross the road, giving up his seat on the bus, getting along with his neighbors, helping his classmates cheat on exams. Fan Shen was a good, useless man in the traditional sense. His parents had passed away long ago, so he was left alone in the hospital, waiting for the day his life came to an end. Good people don't get rewarded. In the silence of the night, Fan Shen seemed to be able to clearly see the muscles in his throat slowly relax, unable to relax anymore. His breathing muscles also gradually lost their elasticity like a rubber band, weakly flattening out. The clean little nurse in the hospital was nowhere to be seen. Next to her was an old woman, who was talking about something with pity in her eyes. Am I going to die like this? His fear of death and his desire for a taste of life filled him with a mixture of emotions he had never felt before. The person to send him off was not the cute little nurse he had been hoping for, but this obeisant. This undoubtedly added to Fan Shen's melancholy. Miserable and sad, his eyes drooped, looking at the black cloth covering the window of the ward to block the sunlight. He felt that life was really as lonely as dog shit. Miserable and sad, a drop of wet liquid slipped from the corner of his eye. Fan Shen felt a little sad. He stuck out his tongue and licked the tears that had slid from the corner of his eye to his lip. He was surprised to find that his tears were not only salty, but also had a slight fishy smell. Was it because he rarely bathed in the hospital that even his tears began to stink? He couldn't help but curse in his heart. Who asked you to cry? Who asked you to cry? Do you really think you're the male lead of a romance novel? But he immediately realized that something was wrong. Why could his tongue stretch out of his lips to lick his tears? According to the doctor, his tongue had long lost its ability to move. The only use it had now was to easily slide back into his esophagus and block his airway, thus becoming a rare genius in the world who committed suicide by swallowing his tongue. Then, he found that it was easier for him to open his eyes. His field of vision was very wide, and his eyesight was much better than before he got sick. The scenery in front of him was clear and bright, and there was an object made of bamboo lying in front of him. Fan Shen, who had been in a daze, suddenly saw a shocking scene through the bamboo shards. More than 10 men in black, brimming with a murderous aura, were holding sharp weapons in their hands, hacking at him. For a moment, he had no time to tell if this was a dream or a strange experience before death. He instinctively shrank his head back and covered his face with his hands. If it had been any other ordinary person, they would probably have done the same thing. Swoosh, 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 swoosh. Countless sounds of breaking air rang out. This was followed by countless muffled grunts, and then silence. After a while, Fan Shen felt that something was wrong. He carefully separated 2 fingers from the hands covering his face and secretly looked outside. The bamboo basket in front of him divided the space in front of him into countless pieces. Looking through these holes, he could clearly see more than 10 corpses lying on the ground. Blood flowed on the ground and the fishy smell filled the air. Fan Shen was frightened. Everything in front of him was too real, and he couldn't come back to his senses for a moment. Then, he suddenly thought of the hands on his face. Could it be that his hands could move? Could it be that his illness had really been cured? Then what was going on in front of him? Was this all a dream? When he woke up, would he still be lying on a sickbed, unable to move, a cripple who could only wait for death? If that was really the case, then it was better not to wake up from this dream. At least his hands could move, and his eyes could blink. He thought sorrowfully and touched his wet face with his hand. When he pulled his hand back, he found that it was covered in blood. It turned out that the drop of wet liquid that had dripped from the corner of his eye was someone's blood that had splashed onto his face. Fanshin stared blankly at his hands, screaming in his heart that these were definitely not his hands. In front of him was a pair of white, tender, and adorable little hands. They were stained with blood, and they looked as strange and enchanting as a white lotus that had bloomed in Azura's field. They were definitely not the hands of an adult. A series of emotional shocks surged into Fanshin's mind. He couldn't help but be stunned. Countless questions and incomparable fear occupied his body and mind. It was the 57th year of the Qin kingdom. His Majesty had led an army to conquer the western barbarians, but the war had not yet ended. Count Sinan was also with the army, and the Empress Dowager and the Council of Elders were in charge of the capital. On this day, a fire broke out at Taiping Villa on the outskirts of the capital by the Lujing River. A group of nocturnal experts took advantage of the fire to break into the villa, killing anyone they saw. A young servant from the courtyard took advantage of the night to break out of the encirclement with his young master. They were chased by a group of villains dressed in nocturnal clothes. The two sides fought all the way to the south entrance of the city. The experts who were ambushing them did not expect that this disabled youth was actually an unfathomable expert. Behind the hills, there were unexpectedly reinforcements from the other side. The identities of these reinforcements made these people even more terrified. Black Knights. The assassins, who had been shot to death by crossbow bolts, lay in pools of blood and cried out in anguish. The reinforcements were mounted on horses, wearing black armor. Under the moonlight, they glowed with a faint, soul-devouring luster. Each of the cavalrymen was armed with a hard crossbow, which only the army was allowed to equip. Earlier, the rapid firing of the crossbow bolts had killed most of the assassins. Surrounded by the Black Knights was a middle-aged man sitting in a carriage. His face was pale, and he had a sparse beard on his chin. He looked at the young servant, who was carrying a child on his back, and nodded. He then clapped his hands lightly. The clapping was the signal to attack. The cavalry separated into a group, and like a sickle in the night, they mercilessly charged into the ranks of assassins, who had suffered heavy casualties. Suddenly, a sorcerer among the assassins raised his staff and began to chant an incantation. Everyone present could feel some unknown energy beginning to gather at the edge of the hills. The middle-aged man in the carriage frowned slightly, but did not move. Suddenly, a black shadow leaped out from beside him, flying through the night like a hawk. With a crisp sound, the sorcerer's chanting came to an abrupt end. His head flew high into the air, and blood fell like rain. The middle-aged man in the carriage shook his head. These sorcerers from the West just don't understand. In the face of a true powerhouse, magic is like the Prime Minister's pen. It's useless. Dozens of Black Knights confirmed that the surroundings were safe. They clenched their right fists and made a hand gesture, reporting that the surrounding assassins had been cleared. The cavalry parted, and the carriage inside slowly moved forward, stopping in front of the young servant. The middle-aged man in the carriage sat in a wheelchair with the help of his subordinate. The middle-aged man with crippled legs pushed the wheelchair under him, slowly approaching the center of the field, toward the young man who had been standing as straight as a spear. Looking at the bamboo basket on the young servant's back, the middle-aged man in the wheelchair finally showed a hint of red on his pale face. Finally, nothing happened. The man carrying the bamboo basket had his face covered with a black cloth, and in his hand was a black iron rod that looked like a sword. Blood was slowly dripping from the iron rod, and beside him were many corpses. The corpses were all experts in the ambush, and there was blood on the throats of the corpses. It seemed that they had been killed in one blow. "I need you to give me an explanation for this matter," the man with the black cloth over his eyes said coldly. The man with the black cloth over his eyes said coldly. His voice didn't tremble, and there was not a trace of emotion in it. The middle-aged man in the wheelchair had a look of pity on his face. "Of course, I will give you an explanation, and I must also give my master an explanation." The young servant with the black bandage nodded and prepared to leave. "Where are you taking this child?" The middle-aged man in the wheelchair said coldly. "You're blind. Do you want the young master to wander the world with you? This is the young lady's flesh and blood. This is also the master's flesh and blood," the middle-aged man in the wheelchair said coldly. "I promise that I will find a very safe place for the young master in the capital." The man shook his head and pulled the black cloth over his face. The middle-aged man in the wheelchair knew that other than the young lady, even his master couldn't order him around. He could only sigh and try to persuade him. "The things in the capital will be settled when the master returns. Why must you take him away? I don't trust your master." The middle-aged man frowned, as if he hated what the man said. He paused for a while and said, "A child can drink milk and read. Do you know how to do these things?" He sneered. "Blind man, what else can you do besides killing?" The man wasn't angry. He gently pushed the bamboo basket on his back. "Cripple, it seems like you only know how to kill." The middle-aged man smiled sinisterly. This time, only the nobles in the capital took action. "Once the master returns, I will naturally start to clean them up." The blind young man shook his head. The middle-aged man gently stroked the wheelchair, as if trying to guess what she was afraid of. After a moment, he frowned and said, "I know what you're afraid of, but in this secular world, besides the child's father who can protect him, who else has the ability to protect him from that unknown danger?" The blind young man suddenly spoke. His voice was still as emotionless as before. "A new identity, a life without being disturbed." The middle-aged man thought for a while and nodded with a smile. "Where?" "Donjo Port. The master's mother is currently living there." After a moment of silence, the blind young man finally accepted the arrangement. The middle-aged man smiled as he pushed the wheelchair to the back of the blind young man. He reached out to take the child from the bamboo basket and sighed as he looked at the child's adorable face that looked like a snow sculpture. "He really looks exactly like his mother. He's so beautiful." He suddenly laughed out loud. "This little fellow will definitely be successful when he grows up." His subordinates stood in silence a distance away. When they suddenly heard their master laughing so happily, though they remained calm on the surface, deep down, they were extremely shocked. They wondered how important the child was. The blind young man tilted his head and reached out to take the child back. Though he was more innocent than normal humans, he was unwilling to let the child's face be too close to the venomous snake's hand. At the same time, he used a one-syllable word to express a purely polite question. The middle-aged man smiled as he looked at the child's face. There was an indescribable and especially terrifying feeling in his smile. "He's only 2 months old, but he's able to wipe the blood off his face. After experiencing such a terrifying thing tonight, he can still sleep so soundly. He's really—" He suddenly lowered his voice to make sure that his subordinates could not hear him. "The child of a heavenly meridian." The middle-aged man held great power in the capital, and he was extremely ruthless. Whenever an official who committed a crime fell into his hands, he would reveal the truth within 2 days, and he had a sharp eye. Even so, an extraordinary person like him could not tell that the child was not sleeping soundly, but had fainted from fear. Heavenly meridian referred to heaven, and meridian referred to the bloodline. A heavenly meridian referred to the bloodline left behind by heaven in the human world. According to the legends in this world, a bloodline left behind by heaven in the human world would awaken every few centuries. This bloodline could represent an undefeatable battle prowess. For example, there was a great general in the distant ancient country of Nas. When his country was about to be destroyed by the barbarians, he used his bravery and battle prowess to assassinate most of the members of the barbarian primitive parliament. There were also some heavenly meridian who displayed great talent in art or wisdom, such as the great wizard Paul and his wife, the playwright Fu Bo, who had just died 300 years ago in the West. Naturally, no one could prove that they were the bloodline left behind by heaven for the suffering of the human world. But in reality, these people brought peace and many other things to the human world. Moreover, all of the heavenly meridian disappeared without a trace. No one, not even the country, could find a trace of them. They just suddenly appeared and suddenly disappeared. Other than leaving behind some obscure records, there was nothing to prove their existence. The middle-aged man in the wheelchair happened to be one of the few people who knew of the existence of the heavenly meridian. For some reason, after Fan Shin died, his soul came to this world, and just like that, he was inconceivably reincarnated into the body of a baby. Moreover, this baby's father or mother was unexpectedly the mysterious and unfathomable heavenly meridian of the continent. At daybreak, the battlefield had already been cleaned up. The carriage slowly moved up the stone road to the east. Behind the carriage, a group of black cavalry and a pale, middle-aged man sitting on a wheeled horse formed a very strange and enchanting scene. The carriage hit a stone, and the sound of a ripple woke up the baby lying flat on a soft silk cushion. The baby's eyes left the faces of the people who had saved his life somewhat listlessly, and looked in front of the carriage. Unlike the wandering gaze of an ordinary baby, it was incomparably clear, but unable to focus, and had a few traces of something that could not be explained clearly. No one knew that such a soft little body actually contained a soul from a different world. As far as the eye could see, the curtain of the carriage fluttered in the oncoming wind, revealing a corner of the green mountains outside the carriage and the long stone road behind it. It was like countless pictures, continuously rewinding. In front of the carriage, the blind youth was tightly gripping the iron drill in his hand. His eyes were covered with a black cloth, covering both his eyes and the sky. Chapter 2. Danzhou Port was to the east of the kingdom of Qing. Although it was by the sea, several ports in the south had recently been built, and the expected sea route to the west had long been connected. As a result, the center of the country's trade had shifted south. The port gradually showed signs of decline, and the bustling port in the past had become quiet a few years ago. Seagulls flew freely, no longer harassed by those hateful sailors. On the other hand, the residents that lived in Danzhou Port did not feel that their lives had changed much. Their income had decreased, but His Majesty had exempted them from taxes for a few years, so they were living quite well. Besides, the port was very beautiful, and it was quiet now, so it was naturally more suitable for people to live in. Occasionally, some big shots would choose to build their manors here. But because it was too far from the capital, not many officials actually stayed. The only one who could be considered as such was the old lady in the courtyard in the west of the city. It was said that the old lady was the mother of Count Sinan in the capital, and had chosen to retire here. The residents of the city knew that Count Sinan seemed to be greatly appreciated by His Majesty, and that he had not been sent out in accordance with the law. Instead, he had stayed in the capital to work in the Ministry of Finance, so most of them were respectful to the old lady. But children did not understand such things. It was a fine day, and the adults were sitting in a tavern, enjoying the salty and humid sea breeze, the salted plums, and the wine in their glasses. A group of teenagers surrounded the stone steps of the back door of Count Sinan's manor in the west of the city. They were so densely packed together that it was hard to tell what they were doing. Looking closer, he discovered that it was a very interesting scene. It turned out that these youths were all listening to a child who was only 4 or 5 years old. The little boy was very handsome, with picturesque eyebrows and clear eyes. His voice was still childish, but his tone was very mature. He sighed and gestured with his small arms. It said that Truman walked to the wall and found a ladder there, so he walked up step by step and found the door. He pushed the door open and walked out, and then, naturally, he returned to the world. The little boy pouted, as if annoyed that the older teenagers would ask such a retarded question. No way? Didn't he go and kill that Hani? Ha-and-I is dead, another teenager answered. Yes, isn't Truman going to beat up that Hani to vent his anger? He was locked up like this for many years. The little boy shrugged. Nope. Tisk. How boring, young Master Fan Xian. Today's story isn't as good as the one from a few days ago. What do you like to listen to then? An ethereal journey. Charm Monogatari. Bang! The little boy called Fan Xian pointed his middle finger at the children around him who were older than him. Fighting and killing isn't healthy. Digging for treasures everywhere isn't environmentally friendly. Suddenly, an extremely angry voice came from the courtyard. Young master, where have you been? The children in a circle imitated him, and also raised their middle fingers. But because there were so many of them, it was much more spectacular. Bang! They all laughed and dispersed. The little boy called Fan Xian stood up from the stone steps, patted the dust off his buttocks, and ran into the courtyard. But before he closed the door, his sharp eyes glanced at the blind young owner of the grocery store across the street. His face showed a complex expression that did not match his age, and he gently closed the wooden door. This was Fan Xian's 4th year in this world. In these years, he finally understood that he was not dreaming. He had really come to an unknown world. This world seemed to be the same as the one in his memory, but also seemed to be very different. By eavesdropping on the servants in the Count's manor, he finally understood his identity. He was the illegitimate son of Count Sinan in the capital. Just like in the typical feud between the rich and the powerful, an illegitimate son could easily fall prey to the evil schemes of the first aunt or second aunt. Fan Xian's father seemed to have only one son, so in order to continue the Count's bloodline, he was sent to Danzhou Harbor, which was very far from the capital. Over the years, he gradually got used to his identity. The soul of an adult trapped in the body of a child would experience a completely different experience, both physically and psychologically. If it were a normal person, they would probably go crazy. But coincidentally, in Fan Xian's previous life, he was a patient with myasthenia gravis and had been bedridden for many years. Now it was just a little inconvenient for him to move around. Compared to the miserable situation in his previous life, it was nothing. So now that he was living in the child's body, he didn't feel too uncomfortable. The most uncomfortable thing was actually his current name. When he was 1 year old, the Count of the capital sent him a letter and gave him the name Fan Xian, courtesy name and Ji. It was not a good name. It sounded like a curse from his hometown. You're a nuisance. But his appearance was only that of a child, so it was impossible for him to object verbally. When he was treated in the hospital in his previous life, he could still move his head, so he often begged the cute little nurse to buy him pirated DVDs and books. After living in the Count's residence for a long time, although the old lady was cold on the outside but warm on the inside, and loved him very much, and the maids in the residence did not treat him differently because of his identity as an illegitimate son, the pain of not being able to communicate with others still made him a little unhappy. Could he tell the maids that he was from another world? Could he tell the teacher that he actually recognized all the words in the book? So he often sneaked out of the Count's residence's side door and played with the commoners' children on the street. More often than not, he told them stories, movies, and novels from his world. It seemed that he wanted to remind himself of something, to remind himself that he did not belong to this world, and that there were movies, the internet, and YY novels in his world. Until today, for some reason, he told the movie, The Truman Show. The movie's plot was a little dull, and there was no Jim Carrey acting cute, so he should have known that the teenagers in Donjo Harbor would not like it. But he still told it, because deep in his heart there was always a sense of absurdity. He was clearly a person who was going to die, so why was he suddenly reborn in this body? He could not help but think of the movie. Perhaps the people in front of him, the streets and the seagulls flying in the sky were all arranged by someone? Just like The Truman Show. In the end, The Truman Show discovered that the world he was in was fake, so he resolutely took a boat and found the exit. But Fan Shin, no, it should be Fan Xian, knew that he was not The Truman Show. This world was real, and it was not a big film studio. So he found that telling stories every day to remind himself that he was from another world was a very absurd action in itself. Chapter 3. The only good thing about his rebirth was that his limbs were now nimble, and he could jump about. Fan Xian was gratified by this realization. Those who had not suffered from his disease would probably find it difficult to feel this kind of happiness. He comforted himself by thinking that perhaps this was a gift from God. It took him 4 whole years to figure out this problem. Since he had the chance to live again, why not live it to the fullest? Since God had bestowed a new life upon him, if he did not live it well, would that not be disrespecting God? For example, since he could move now, why not move more? So all the servants in the Count's manor knew that this young master, born of a concubine, was someone who could not sit still. "Young master, I beg of you, come down quickly." At that moment, Fan Xian was sitting at the highest point of the artificial mountain in the courtyard, looking at the distant horizon with a smile. But in the eyes of the servant girl, a 4-year-old child had climbed to such a high place, and had such a mature smile. It was obvious that the little fellow had lost his mind. Gradually, more and more people gathered at the foot of the artificial mountain. 7 or 8 servants surrounded the mountain anxiously. Although Count Sinan was appreciated by His Majesty, his rank was not high, and his official position was not high. He did not have much income, and even if he did, he could not possibly spend it all on his mother and illegitimate child. As a result, there were not many servants in the Count's estate. Fan Xian looked at the anxious faces of the people at the foot of the artificial mountain and could not help but sigh. He obediently climbed down. "It's just a little exercise. What's the rush?" The servants had long since become accustomed to their young master's strange habit of imitating the way adults speak. They took him in their arms and went to take a bath. When Fan Xian came out, his lips red, his teeth white, his body fragrant and tender, the servant girl picked him up again. Smiling, she caressed his face and teased, "Young master, you are born like a young lady from another family. Who knows which young lady will live a good life in the future?" Stupidly, Fan Xian didn't respond. He wasn't going to use the mouth of a 4-year-old to tease a teenage servant girl. He didn't want to do such a tasteless thing. He would wait until he was 6 before he began this great and challenging work. "It's time to take a nap, little ancestor." The maid patted the little fellow's buttock. They had always found it strange that although the young master of the Count's estate was young and had begun to show signs of naughtiness, he had always maintained the self-discipline and hard work of an adult. For example, taking a nap. Anyone who had a normal childhood would always remember the glorious deeds of how they fought against the demons who forced them to sleep under the bright and beautiful noontime sun. Some of the demons called him father, some called him mother, and some called him teacher. But young Master Fan Xian was the kind of person who never needed to be forced to take a nap. Every noon, he would put on his most adorable and innocent smile, obediently return to his bedroom, and begin to sleep. He would not make a sound in the middle of it all. At first, Madame Dowager didn't believe it and asked the maids to keep an eye on the little fellow. She thought that he was using sleeping as an excuse to fool around on the bed. However, after watching him for half a year, she found that the child was really in a deep sleep every time. Even shouting at him was difficult to wake him up. From then on, the maids no longer paid attention to this matter. Whenever he slept, they would usually keep watch outside. It was summer, and the maids were naturally very tired. They tilted their bodies and gently waved the little fans in their hands. Occasionally, a firefly would dance in the wind. Returning to his bedroom, Fan Xian climbed onto the bed and lifted the mat covering it. He carefully took out a book from a hidden compartment he had dug out from underneath. The cover of the book was slightly yellow, and it looked a little old, but there was not a single word on it. However, there were some patterns embroidered on the corners of the book that represented some unknown meaning. Every stroke was curled up at the end like a flowing cloud, or like the corner of a wide sleeve that had a rather ancient charm. He gently flipped open the book to the 7th page. There was a drawing of a naked man, with some faint red lines on his body. He didn't know what kind of paint had been used to draw them, but it gave the viewer the illusion that these lines were slowly flowing in a certain direction. Fan Xian sighed. His appearance was only that of a 4-year-old, so he didn't dare reveal too much of his true nature. Fortunately, he had this book to help him pass the time of extreme boredom. This book had been left to him by a blind youth named Wu Zhu when he was very young. Fan Xian had always remembered that blind youth, the servant of his mother in this world. When he had been trapped in the body of a small infant, he had spent time in the arms of that youth. They had traveled from the capital to this port by the sea. Perhaps the youth had thought that he was too young to remember anything, but Fan Xian's soul was not that of an ignorant infant. Along the way, he could tell that the blind youth's care for the infant came from his heart, and could not be fake. But for some reason, after the blind youth had taken Fan Xian to Count Sinan's manor, he had left. No matter how much the Countess had tried to persuade him to stay, he had not. Before he left, he had placed the book next to the infant's body. Fan Xian had always been puzzled about this. Was the servant not afraid that he would blindly practice? When he thought about it, he realized the reason. He was a child, and there was no way he could recognize the words in the book. Naturally, he was not afraid of any problems. But Fan Xian just so happened to recognize the words of this world. After the great changes of his rebirth, he was even convinced of ghosts and immortals. He was even more convinced that the book before him, which looked like a prop from a Hong Kong TV series, was some kind of Jinqi training method. It was a pity that it did not have a name. Otherwise, he could go to the children on the street and ask them if this Jinqi training method was powerful or not. Thinking of this, Fan Xian laughed foolishly. Since the wretched heavens had given him a second chance, he had to cherish it. This internal force was something that did not exist in his previous world. Even if the nameless breathing method before him was nothing special, he could not stop himself from practicing it at the age of 1. One must know that this was only a few realms lower than if one had started training in the womb. Everyone in the world, including the great grandmasters who were worshipped as gods, could not be like Fan Xian, no matter how talented they were. They could not start practicing internal Jinqi from birth. What was this called? The early bird catches the worm. The clumsy bird flies first. Furthermore, he could not be more stupid than those youths who had just begun to learn martial arts, could he? As Fan Xian thought about this, the Jinqi, which he could already feel, began to flow through his body, following the lines drawn in the book. It was a very comfortable feeling, as if a warm stream of water was cleansing every inch of his internal organs. Gradually, he entered a meditative state and fell asleep comfortably on the bed. Chapter 4. What Fan Xian didn't know was that he was practicing an extremely advanced method of internal strength. If he was a normal warrior, he would practice it with extreme caution, and would ask a teacher or a trustworthy friend to help watch over him. The most dangerous part of this method was at the beginning. When accumulating energy into the snow mountain in the Dantian, there would be a huge difference in the reaction speed of the cultivator's body and mind. The most direct consequence was that the cultivator's bodily functions would become like that of a vegetable, unable to move. If the cultivator had no experience, it was easy to mistakenly think that he had gone mad, and force the Zhenqi into his body. If the cultivator was lucky, he might be able to return the chaotic Zhenqi to his meridians, but that would mean that the practice would be of no use. If the cultivator was a beginner, he might panic and cause a true demon to invade him. But for a beginner like Fan Xian, not only did he not go mad, but he experienced that mysterious feeling more easily than the strong. This was all thanks to his background and luck. When he first started practicing this nameless Zhenqi, the body he lived in was still an infant. The innate Zhenqi from his mother's body had not yet been completely returned to the world, and was still in his body. Thus, his practice was twice the result with half the effort, and he even managed to store a large portion of the innate Zhenqi in his meridians. And for Fan Xian, the demon that was the easiest for a cultivator to encounter, was not difficult at all. Don't forget, in his previous life, Fan Xian had been bedridden for many years. He had long gotten used to his brain not being able to direct his body, so he did not panic when he encountered this situation for the first time. Instead, he felt the warmth of finding the remnant memories of his past. So when he first started practicing, he was not very afraid when the Zhenqi began to scatter, making it impossible for his body to move. Because he was fearless, his mind was free of distracting thoughts, and he easily passed through the most difficult hurdle. From then on, practice became simple. He only needed to silently recite the method, and he would naturally enter a meditative state. So for Fan Xian, his daily naps were very sweet, and could not be woken up by thunder. It was extremely difficult for ordinary cultivators to enter a meditative state, because it required luck and coincidence. For this child to meditate every day was an indescribable luxury. The heavens really did care for him. When she woke up, she rolled her fresh and lovely face in the towel in the servant girl's hand, which was considered washing her face. In the afternoon, he began to study with a teacher from Donghai County, who was specially invited by the Earl's mansion in the study. The teacher was not very old, about 30 years old, but his body gave off a very old and rotten smell. He didn't know if it was because Fan Xian was an illegitimate child, but although the old lady didn't mistreat him, she always had high expectations of him. As a result, she always seemed a little distant. Fan Xian remembered that when he was only 1 year old, the old lady before him had held him in her arms and wept in the middle of the night. Of course, the old lady didn't expect a 1-year-old infant to understand her words, and she silently remembered them. "Child, if you want to blame someone, blame your father. Poor thing, your mother died as soon as you were born." Past? That was a big question in Fan Xian's mind. When he first arrived in this world, he had been ambushed. Although he now knew that his father was Count Sinan, a high-ranking official in the capital whom he had never met, who was his mother? Back then, Count Sinan had been with the Emperor on the Western expedition, and the assassins had naturally targeted his mother. But the soul within him belonged to another world, so naturally he couldn't have any father-son feelings for Count Sinan, whom he had never met. He would only occasionally think of the woman who had already left this world, his mother in name. Chapter 5. What are you thinking about? The 2 servant girls were serving the dishes. The little girl, who sat to Fan Xian's right, pouted. The little girl's skin was a little dark, and she was a little thin. Sitting next to Fan Xian, who was as pretty as a girl, she looked particularly pitiful. Fan Xian reached out and ruffled the little girl's yellow hair. I was thinking about what you usually eat in the capital. This little girl, who was even younger than Fan Xian, was Count Sinan's daughter. She was his half-sister, and her name was Ruoro. Because she had been sickly since childhood, and the Countess loved her dearly, she had been brought to Danzhou a year ago to recuperate. But after nearly a year, there had been no improvement. Her hair was still rather sparse. Naturally, the family of an official would not lack food and clothing, so she could not be malnourished. She was probably born with a weak constitution. Fan Xian and the little girl hit it off very well. Although he dealt with the little girl with the mentality of an uncle, it was only because he felt sorry for her that he often took her out to play and told her stories. In the eyes of others, however, it became evidence of their deep sibling love. Fan Xian's identity was a little awkward. After all, an illegitimate child could not be compared to a legitimate daughter, so the servant girls deliberately avoided mentioning the Count's estate in the capital. Hearing her brother's question, the little girl very seriously began to count with her fingers what she usually ate in the capital. But no matter how she counted, the 3-year-old girl could not remember anything. She could only repeatedly say tong hulu and dough figurines. By the time they finished eating, it was already late. The sun was halfway down the other side of the land, and a thick twilight enveloped the entire courtyard. Ruoro, you really are weak. Big brother bullies me. Well, what do you want to hear today? Snow White. Fan Xian suddenly laughed. Fortunately, there was no one else around, or they would have been shocked to see the strange smile on the face of a 4-year-old boy. Big brother will tell you a ghost story, okay? No. Fan Ruoro was startled. She shook her head vigorously, and 2 clear streams of tears rolled down her tanned cheeks. It was clear that she had been tormented by many ghost stories in the past year. Bullying little girls was just one of Fan Xian's vices. He was best at bullying servant girls. He often told them ghost stories, which would scare the youthful girls into screaming non-stop. They would all huddle together on the bed, shivering. Although it was impossible for Fan Xian to tease them verbally in order to hide himself, he could still enjoy a fragrant embrace at this time. He comforted himself that he was still a child and was still in the stage where he needed to be touched. This was not considered shameless, but a very normal need. Every time the maids were curious about how a young man like him could know so many terrible stories, Fan Xian would blame it on the teacher. Therefore, the maids were now looking at the teacher with a somewhat unfriendly gaze. They thought to themselves, Lord Count spent a lot of money to hire you to teach the young master, but you actually told him a ghost story. Not only did you scare the child, but you also scared us flowers. You've committed a great sin. As usual, after the ghost story was over, the 2 maids looked shocked but still satisfied. They helped the little fellow wash up and then closed the door to let him sleep. It seemed to be another ordinary night. Fan Xian put the hard porcelain pillow under his head to one side, and went to the wardrobe to take out a winter robe. He tidied it into a square, and it became a pillow. He leaned against the pillow, but his eyes were open, shining in the dark. He did not fall asleep for a long time. Although he had accepted the fact that he had been reincarnated into this world, he could not necessarily get used to it. It was probably around 9 o'clock at night, and it was very uncomfortable to have to sleep. Moreover, he had slept in bed for a long time in his previous life. He touched the surface of the bed and found that the secret compartment he had made could not be seen by others. He relaxed a little, and very naturally, the zhenqi in his body began to flow slowly, and he could enter the state of meditation at any time. The moment before he entered the state of emptiness, Fan Xian thought about how he should live in this world. How should he live for the next few decades? Before he had time to enter the vegetative state and fantasize about his future wives and concubines, he was awakened by an uninvited guest. "Are you Fan Xian?" A person suddenly appeared in front of his bed. The person's eyes were a cold color, and there was an unusual brown in his pupils. It was obvious at a glance that this person did not love life very much. It was a very polite question, but if it came from the mouth of someone who sneaked into your bedroom in the middle of the night, covered his face, holding a knife in his hand, and carrying a few small bags on his waist, it would undoubtedly be very frightening. Fortunately, Fan Xian was not a real 4-year-old boy. Otherwise, when he saw this strange uncle, he would certainly have cried out at the first moment. Even if he thought about it with his toes, he could tell that a person who could quietly enter the Count's manor at night was certainly a powerful and ruthless fellow. If he cried out, he would certainly be killed. Thinking of this, Fan Xian could not help but feel proud of his ability to remain calm in the face of danger. He coughed twice and suppressed the incomparable nervousness in his heart. Pretending to be the most adorable child, he threw himself forward. "Dad, you're finally back." A 4-year-old boy threw himself into the arms of an assassin, his eyes brimming with tears. His hands were tightly wrapped around the assassin's waist, but the child's hands were too short to wrap around the assassin's waist. All he could do was grab at the assassin's clothes, as if afraid that the assassin would run away. Perhaps because he grabbed too hard, the boy tore a piece of the assassin's clothes with a tearing sound. The Nightwalker frowned. He didn't seem to move, but he pulled himself out of Fan Xian's embrace. He stood there in a daze, as if wondering why the illegitimate son of Count Sinan would call him father. At the same time, he was puzzled. His clothes were of the finest quality, and even a knife would not be able to easily cut them. How could this child tear them with his bare hands? He was puzzled, and Fan Xian was even more puzzled. When there was no one around, Fan Xian would often use rocks from the rockery to test the power of his nameless Xinqi. When he discovered that his slender little fingers could, with some difficulty, crush the soft stones, he had a certain degree of confidence in his ability to defend himself. With great difficulty, Fan Xian had used the 4-year-old boy's crying trick to make the assassin lower his guard. Then he had gathered all his Xinqi into his fingers, thinking that he would be able to subdue the assassin, who knew that he would only be able to tear off a few pieces of cloth. It seemed that something was about to happen. Chapter 6. Although Fan Xian looked like he was only 4 years old, he was a mature soul on the inside. The blood and corpses of his first day in this world were firmly imprinted in his mind, so he had always felt very uneasy. He knew that his unclear past would one day bring him trouble. It seemed that trouble had finally come today. His sneak attack had failed, so he couldn't use the same trick again. He sobbed pitifully, trying to confuse the Nightwalker. At the same time, his mind raced, trying to think of a way to escape. If he called for help, the Nightwalker would certainly kill him in a very short time. Seeing that the Nightwalker was not making any moves, it was clear that he had been stunned by Fan Xian's random call of "Daddy." Fan Xian's mind worked very quickly. Seeing that his sneak attack had failed, he relied on his innate advantage of being too young. He looked at the Nightwalker and began to cry. "Daddy, Daddy!" As he cried, he nervously began to think of a way to escape. "There's no need to pretend, Master Fan." The Nightwalker's tone was very indifferent, but it didn't seem to be dangerous. "It seems that you are very clever, knowing how to protect yourself at such a young age. But you should know very well that I am not the Count." Having said this, the Nightwalker gestured with the knife in his hand, and then approached the 4-year-old Fan Xian. Fan Xian's face was still innocent and flawless. Tears streamed down his cheeks, but his heart tightened. He sobbed. "Then who are you, uncle? I was sent by your father to see you, so don't call me that." The Nightwalker's eyes were a little brown, and he looked a little ugly. The wrinkles at the corners of his eyes gave away his age, and the way he spoke made Fan Xian think of those old men who tricked little girls into looking at goldfish. But Fan Xian didn't show it. He still perfectly played the part of a 4-year-old child, a little fear, a little surprise, and a little anger. "You're not Daddy." Then, as if he didn't see the knife in the night walker's hand, he twisted his little butt and climbed onto the bed. "I don't even know what Daddy looks like," he muttered. The night walker laughed darkly and walked over to the bedside. Suddenly, the little boy turned his head to look behind the night walker. His eyes flashed with surprise. "Mommy!" he cried. This was a very tricky move. If it had been anyone else, they probably wouldn't have been able to fool the Nightwalker. After all, the Nightwalker was a master who owned an independent laboratory in the capital. But the one who used this trick was a 4-year-old boy, so the Nightwalker naively believed it. And when he heard Fan Xian call him mother, his eyes revealed a look of extreme shock, and he suddenly turned his head to look behind him. Behind him was naturally the tightly shut door and the thick darkness of the night. Bang! A crisp sound rang out in the bedroom. The Nightwalker lay on the ground with blood all over his head. Fan Xian held the half-broken porcelain pillow in his hand and looked at the man on the ground with lingering fear. He weighed the broken pillow in his hand, gritted his teeth, raised his small arm, and viciously smashed it into the back of the man's head. This was a muffled sound, and the person had used a lot of strength. Even if this Nightwalker was a grandmaster, he would not be able to wake up for a while after being hit by this heavy pillow. The chief maid's voice came from outside. "What's wrong?" "It's nothing, sister. I broke a cup. I'll come back tomorrow to fix it." "How can we do that? What if you hurt the young master's foot?" "I said I'll do it tomorrow." Hearing the gentle, innocent, and adorable young master throw a rare temper tantrum, the maid shut her mouth and said nothing more. Fan Xian walked back to the wardrobe and struggled to pull out a winter quilt. Then he tore the quilt into strips with 2 fingers and twisted them, firmly tying up the unconscious Nightwalker on the ground. Only now did he realize that his back was completely wet. A trace of lingering fear welled up in his heart. Whether it was in his previous life or this one, this was the first time he had tried to kill someone. Although he didn't know if he had killed the man, he had taken too much of a risk. If the man really was a master of martial arts, then he would certainly have lost his life. He put his hand under the Nightwalker's black mask and found that the man was still breathing. For some reason, Fan Xian suddenly had the thought of killing him to silence him. But then he realized that after his rebirth, he seemed to have become much more resilient. He had acted so ruthlessly, without the slightest hesitation. He didn't realize it himself, because in the heart of the child called Fan Xian, he had already died once. This rebirth was especially precious, so he wouldn't allow anyone to harm his life. Only when you're drunk do you know the weight of life. Only when you're dead do you know the weight of life. It was that simple. Holding the knife in his hand, Fan Xian thought about it again and again. He still couldn't make up his mind to kill the unconscious Nightwalker. Suddenly, he thought of someone, and his face lit up with joy. He quietly opened the door, ran to the backyard, and crawled out through the dog hole. He came to the grocery store on the corner of the street across from the Count's mansion. Knock, 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 knock. He gently knocked on the door of the grocery store. The sound was very soft, and in the quiet night of Danzhou, it didn't travel far. But Fan Xian knew that the person inside could certainly hear the knocking. Although that person had pretended not to know him for 4 years, when things came to this, Fan Xian could only think of one person he could trust. "Who's there?" An extremely calm and emotionless voice came from the grocery store. Fan Xian thought that this person was still the same as he was back in the capital, speaking and doing things in a methodical manner. He rolled his eyes and said quietly, "I'm Fan Xian." Sure enough, as Fan Xian expected, the wooden door of the grocery store opened without a sound. The blind youth stood like a ghost in the doorway, giving Fan Xian a fright. Fan Xian looked at the person in front of him who had brought him to Danzhou harbor. He looked at his cheeks and the black cloth covering his eyes, which didn't seem to have changed in the past 4 years. He was a little curious. Could it be that this person didn't age? Chapter 7. But there was still an unconscious assassin in his bedroom, so he had no time to ask. Someone came to kill me and I knocked him out. He's lying on the floor. The blind youth tilted his head slightly. His heart skipped a beat, but his face remained expressionless. He bowed his head and said, "What nonsense are you talking about, young Master Fan? I don't have time to pretend to be profound. You have to pay attention to me." Fan Xian chuckled, thinking, "Why are you still pretending not to know me at a time like this?" He took the blind youth by the hand and walked in the direction of the manor. "Young master, you're still talking nonsense." The blind youth frowned slightly, as if wondering why the child in front of him seemed to know who he was. When he had sent Fan Xian, still in swaddling clothes, to Danzhou, Fan Xian had only been a few months old, so he shouldn't have had any memories. Could it be that the Count's wife had told him who he was? It was late at night, and a few mournful barks could be heard in the distance. Someone had woken up in the middle of the night and found the wrong door. The blind youth, Wu Zhu, had a cold expression on his face as he listened to Fan Xian. Finally, he moved. He closed the door of the grocery store and walked toward the Count's manor. Fan Xian breathed a sigh of relief and hurried to catch up. Outside the Count's manor, the two of them crawled back through the dog hole and stood in the bedroom, looking at the unconscious assassin on the floor. Fan Xian looked at the man on the floor. He didn't know if he was dead or alive, so he couldn't help but feel a little nervous. "Uncle Wu Zhu," he asked, "you've been staying in the grocery store these past few years, not daring to recognize me. Why?" The blind youth, Wu Zhu, tilted his head again. After a while, he said, "Young master, you really surprised me." He was indeed surprised. Although he knew that the child in front of him was the lady's child, there had to be something different about him. But Wu Zhu hadn't expected him to be so mature at the age of 4 and to be able to plot against Master Fei, who had come to the capital. "Let's deal with this person first." Fan Xian turned the assassin over with some effort and took off his mask, revealing the assassin's true appearance. The assassin's face was thin, and he was already a little old. The beard on his chin had begun to turn white, but for some reason, there was a faint green color mixed in with the white, which made him look a little disgusting. Startled, Fan Xian jumped behind Wu Zhu and grabbed his sleeve. "Uncle," he whimpered, "this assassin doesn't look good. This is Master Fei of the 3rd Bureau of the Overwatch Council." Wu Zhu slowly crouched down and touched the assassin's chin. "He is one of the 3 most adept poisoners in the world. He is an expert in using, identifying, and detoxifying poisons. To think that such a formidable character would be ruined by you with a porcelain pillow. I don't know if you're too lucky, or if he's too unlucky. It's his bad luck." Fan Xian thought to himself. Although he was surprised by the name of the man on the ground, he realized that he had run into a monster who looked like an infant but had lived 2 lives as a demon. His luck was not very good. "Don't touch him with your hands. What if he's poisoned?" Fan Xian reminded Wu Zhu. Wu Zhu did not stop moving, nor did he explain anything. But the way he moved made Fan Xian feel that he was telling him that there was no poison in this world that could kill him. Fan Xian frowned and asked, "Uncle, what do we do with this man?" He wasn't the type of person who was overly familiar with others. It was just that in this world, this blind young man was the first person he had ever known, and the only person he could trust completely. He also knew that this man was a formidable martial artist, so he deliberately acted cute and respectful, saying the word "uncle" over and over again. His eyes darted around and finally fell on the knife. He gritted his teeth, thinking that he might as well stab this Master Fei to death. Sensing his actions, Wu Zhu stood up and shook his head. "Your temperament is far different from the ladies. You're so young, yet you're already so ruthless. I don't know who taught you that. I learned it myself." Fan Xian didn't dare offend the only martial artist he could trust. He said respectfully, "I know that you've been guarding the grocery store to protect me. I also know that you were afraid that my mother's enemies would find me because of you, so I didn't stay in the Count's manor. So I had to be ruthless." Wu Zhu shook his head again, and said nothing. Fan Xian knew that this master servant of his mother was beginning to suspect him. He laughed and asked, "Uncle, what should I do next?" His meaning was clear. It was better to let Uncle Wu Zhu do the killing. Unexpectedly, Wu Zhu said, "Young master, you've hit the wrong person." Hit the wrong person? Fan Xian was stunned. He slowly lowered his head to look at the assassin on the ground, his face covered in blood. "But I've already hit him, so there's no need to think too much about it." Wu Zhu said calmly, "Master Fei is the head of the Third Bureau of the Overwatch Council. His secret identity. To be precise, he's the subordinate of your father's subordinate. So I don't think he came to Danzhou to kill you. If he really did come to kill you, I believe that no matter how capable you are, you would have died countless times over." Only then did Fan Xian remember that the assassin on the ground had said that his father had sent him, but… damn, he looks like Teabag. Who would believe a pervert like him? Fei Jie had been staying in the Institute of the Overwatch Council in the capital these past few years. He was an old man in his 50s, and although he had the reputation of being a master of poisons, he was in a semi-retired state. If it weren't for the fact that someone powerful had asked him to come to Danzhou to teach, and that he didn't have the courage to refuse, he would never have left the capital. But he hadn't expected that the first time he saw his student, he would be beaten up so badly, he would bleed half a bowl of blood and almost lose his life. He looked at the little boy in front of him, and found that his face was innocent and adorable. His big eyes flickered with a hint of fear and shame. Such a cute little face, coupled with his identity as a little boy, left him with nowhere to vent his anger. Turning his head, he saw a servant, and prepared to vent his anger on him. "Who are you? Hurry up and untie me. I'm Master Fei, who was hired by the Count with a lot of money." Unexpectedly, the servant seemed to be even more arrogant than he was. Ignoring him, he said coldly, "The agreement between me and your superior doesn't seem to include you as a teacher." "Master Wu?" Fei Jie widened his murky brown eyes. When he saw the servant's appearance, he was shocked. "Master Wu, it's you." Hearing the assassin call himself Fei Jie after waking up, Fan Xian felt that the matter was indeed puzzling. Chapter 8. Fan Xian thought Fei Jie was puzzled. Didn't my father never care about me, an illegitimate child? Why would he send a teacher to teach me? If it was to teach me how to read, that would be fine. But why did he send an old freak to teach me? Seeing that Fei Jie knew Wu Zhu, Fan Xian knew it was not his place to interrupt. He sat on the bed, feigning ignorance. After the adults had explained everything, Fan Xian used his small arm to remove the bedsheet from Fei Jie's body. He hid behind Wu Zhu and laughed foolishly, pretending to be an idiot. It was a pity that he had shown off a little today. The two powerful figures in front of him knew that this 4-year-old's mind was not as simple as it seemed. The sky was already beginning to brighten. In the distance, the faint crowing of a rooster and the sound of servants boiling water could be heard. Wu Zhu led Fei Jie out the door. But before they left, Fan Xian heard Wu Zhu say something cold. "When are you going to explain how you know who I am?" Fan Xian's heart skipped a beat. He didn't know how to explain. 4 years ago, when he and Wu Zhu had traveled thousands of miles to Danzhou, he had been a baby only a few months old. He thought about it again and again, but couldn't come up with a good excuse. He could only blame himself for being frightened by that strange old man Fei Jie. The city of Danzhou began to wake from its dreams, but the unremarkable grocery store showed no signs of opening. In a dark room in the store, Wu Zhu looked at Fei Jie coldly. "What is the meaning of the cripple?" Although Fei Jie could be considered a master in some areas, He couldn't help but feel a little anxious when he thought of the rumors about the cold-blooded and ruthless young man in front of him. "The young master has to grow up," he replied. "One day you will have to face the problems of the capital. If you prepare early, you will have a better chance of success." Wu Zhu raised his head and looked at him. Although he knew that the man before him was blind, Fei Jie felt that behind the black cloth, there was a murderous glint staring at him. He smiled. "If Master Wu has any objections, I can return to the capital immediately. I believe Master Wu will respect your opinion." Wu Zhu shook his head. "I don't think the cripple sent you here for a simple reason." "Not bad." Fei Jie thought that only the man in front of him would dare to call the headmaster a cripple. He bowed and replied, "The headmaster hasn't been able to find the box left behind by Miss Wu. He's worried that it might be found by someone with ulterior motives, so he'd like to ask for your guidance." "There's no need to look for it. The lady destroyed the chest before she died," Wu Zhu said expressionlessly. Fei Jie nodded and turned to leave. Suddenly he frowned and said, "I always feel that the young master is a little strange." Fifth Master. He is only 4 years old, yet you let him practice such an overbearing Zhen Qi cultivation method. Aren't you afraid that something will happen? The strange part is yet to come. I didn't teach him his Zhenqi cultivation method either. Wu Zhu looked at the poisonous creature that was about to become his young master's teacher. "I'll have to trouble you," he said lightly. Fei Jie touched the dull ache on his head. He felt that these words seemed to be a bad omen, so he took his leave with a bitter smile. After he left, the blind Wu Zhu entered a secret room in the grocery store and stared blankly at a dust-covered chest in the corner. His eyes were still covered by a black cloth, but it was obvious that he was thinking about something. During the day, a strange teacher came to the Count's manor. After handing in his name card, he was personally received by the Countess. Somehow, he gained the Countess' trust and became the second teacher of the Fan family's young master. The maids had long since spread the news, and they all felt it strange. How could a man with a bandaged head, who looked like an old scoundrel, be qualified to be their young master's teacher? In the study, Fan Xian was obediently massaging Mr. Fei's back. Last night, he had knocked Mr. Fei's pillow, and now he had to quickly curry favor. "Teacher, you can't blame me," he said in a childish voice. Deep down, he felt disgusted. "You had a knife. I'm young, so I was a little impulsive." Fei Jie thought that without a knife, how could he pry open the door? He had only planned to sneak in to see what this legendary illegitimate child looked like. Who would have thought that the child would stay up in the middle of the night and play with insomnia? So it was inevitable that there would be a misunderstanding. But the back of his head still hurt. What a pity. In the future, he would find a way to get back at Fan Xian. "I thought you would come to teach me in secret." That's right. In many Jianghu legends, a young man living alone in a small garden will come across a strange person and learn amazing skills. Those around him know nothing about it. This kind of thing is quite common. Fan Xian looked at Fei Jie bitterly, listening to him speak. "But not everyone in this world is stupid. Besides, you're not my daughter-in-law, and I don't like to climb walls every day." Fei Jie's expression was not very good. He looked at the young boy in front of him. "So, since I have an identity, it's better to use that identity to teach you." Fan Xian chuckled and climbed onto his lap. "Teacher, do you know my father? What kind of person is he?" Fei Jie's face turned green and red. He knew that the young boy in front of him was a vicious person, and yet he was still pretending to be naive. He felt completely powerless. Hearing the question, he thought for a moment before replying, "The Count is a friend of my superior, so he asked me to teach you. You should call me teacher in the future." "Teacher? Then what are you going to teach me?" Fei Jie laughed, and a strange light flashed in his slightly brown eyes. "I only know how to use poison." So I'm going to teach you how to use poison to kill people, and how not to be poisoned to death. He had thought that this would scare the little boy to tears, but Fei Jie immediately realized that the little boy in front of him was not an ordinary person, so his trick would probably be useless. Sure enough, Fan Xian's big eyes were full of excitement. His long eyelashes fluttered in a particularly interested manner. Then what are you waiting for? Do you want me to catch a few rabbits to experiment on? Rabbits won't do, so I'll use toads? Fei Jie foolishly turned around, wondering if this little boy was really only 4 years old. A few months later, about a dozen miles away from Danzhou Harbor, in the graveyard, the faint light of dawn shone down on the dark graveyard, making the land seem even more eerie and eerie. Fei Jie clasped his hands together and stood outside the graveyard, watching the young master squatting in the grave. His eyebrows trembled slightly. This time, he had used a trip as an excuse to take a few days off from the Countess of the Count's manor. She had brought Fan Xian to the graveyard to dissect corpses and study the structure of the human body. Although he knew that Fan Xian was different from the average little boy, Fei Jie saw that it only took Fan Xian a short while to get used to the gloomy atmosphere of the graveyard. He quickly steadied his mind and began dissecting the corpses in the graveyard according to what he had learned in the past month. Fei Jie himself was shocked. He had always been a professional in dealing with corpses, but he had never seen a 4-year-old boy who could face a corpse so calmly. There was a foul stench in the graveyard. A beautiful and clean little boy wearing a large mask was using his small hands to pull out a ball of sticky intestines from a half-decomposed corpse. It was a horrifying scene. Fan Xian felt that his second life was just as miserable. Chapter 9. Fan Xian took off his mask and washed his hands with clean water. He began to record the characteristics of the corpse, then analyzed the possible ailments, and recorded them in detail in a large black leather notebook provided by Fei Jie. When he was done, he stood up. His face was pale, and his long eyelashes trembled. "Teacher, is there anything else?" Fei Jie looked at him and frowned. He hadn't expected the kid to be so bold. Before he could say anything, Fan Xian couldn't hold back his nausea any longer. He ran to the bottom of the ridge and began to vomit violently. He waited until the nausea subsided, then stood back up. A trace of gentleness flashed across Fei Jie's eyes. He wondered if it was too cruel to let a 4-year-old come into contact with the most terrifying things in life. It wasn't until he saw Fan Xian vomit that Fei Jie suddenly realized that Fan Xian was truly like a child. It was not as if there was another soul hidden within him at all times. "Forget it. I'll think about it next time." Before Fei Jie could finish his sentence, he heard Fan Xian's childish voice say, "It's a pity that Danzhou Harbor is a small city. Too few people have died, otherwise we could find a fresh corpse." Fei Jie's heart thumped. He slowly turned his head to look at Fan Xian's pure eyes. He didn't know what he was trying to see in them. After a long time, he said coldly, "Why? Huh! Why aren't you afraid? Why aren't you angry at me for making you do these things?" Fei Jie was puzzled. He frowned and looked at the little boy. Fan Xian lowered his head and said respectfully, "Because you told me to poison someone so that I could observe and learn. I'm afraid, so I'd rather dig up a corpse." "So there are things in this world that you're afraid of?" "Yes." Fan Xian looked at him pitifully. "I'm only 4.5. Being young is no excuse." Fei Jie nodded, then shook his head. "You may be young, and perhaps there are some things you don't understand. But you have to know that an illegitimate child of a noble like you will face many conspiracies and harm in the years to come. Sometimes this cheap sympathy can be a weapon that kills oneself." After saying this, Fei Jie had a strange thought. Perhaps everything he said could be understood by the child in front of him. At this moment, the morning light suddenly shone into Fan Xian's half-raised eyes, reflecting a strange luster. Fei Jie's heart trembled. He felt that the little boy's eyes were extremely demonic. He had used poison to kill countless people in his life. During the northern expedition of the late emperor, the poison he concocted killed at least tens of thousands of soldiers of the Northern Wei Kingdom. In terms of crimes, he was destined to go to hell. But why was it that when he looked at the cute little guy in front of him, he couldn't help but feel afraid? After tidying up the tomb, the strange master and disciple began to follow the source of the light to the east. Along the way, Fei Jie suddenly asked, "You must be very curious." "Yes." Fan Xian grunted through his nose, and there was a hint of shyness in his sweet smile. "Teacher is very attentive to me." Fei Jie did not expect the child to give an irrelevant answer. He smiled bitterly and said, "You can still laugh at this time. I really doubt your nerves and the maturity of your brain. Laughing is better than crying." "That's true." Fei Jie's gaze turned to the faintly discernible city walls in the distance. He frowned. "Your father's family property in the capital is very large. In the future, there will be many who will compete with you for the family property. So you must become stronger and learn more." Fan Xian said nothing, but he was calculating in his heart. He had always heard that his father, Count Sinan, was trusted by His Majesty. That was why he had stayed in the capital instead of being sent elsewhere. The year before last, there had been political turmoil in the capital. Who knew how many princes and nobles had died in that coup? In the end, His Majesty had firmly controlled the situation and massacred countless noble families. Although his father was also a noble, he had miraculously maintained His Majesty's trust in him, and his position as an official had only grown higher and higher. But Fan Xian still could not understand what kind of family property could cause his own death. It could cause his father to invite the most terrifying people in the capital, the Overwatch Council, to act as his teacher. "I understand. In the future, there will certainly be people who want to kill me. That's why teacher taught me to use poison. He was actually afraid that I would be poisoned to death." "That's right. There are many ways to kill, but the most convenient, and also the least likely to attract attention, is to use poison." Fei Jie placed his hand on the top of Fan Xian's head and gently stroked it. "My task is to teach you these things within a year, so that in the future no one will be able to poison your food and kill you." "Why now? Weren't you afraid that someone would poison me years ago?" There were some questions that had to be asked clearly, so Fan Xian continued to ask questions, regardless of his fear of letting Fei Jie sense that he was mature beyond his years. Fei Jie smiled, but there was something sinister about it. "Because last month, Count Sinan's concubine gave birth to a son, which means that you have a competitor for the Count's estate. And that concubine just so happens to be connected to some people in the Overwatch Council. Your father is worried that something might happen to you, but it would be inconvenient for him to send someone to protect you for a long period of time. That would only make it easier for you to surface. That's why he arranged for me to teach you." Fan Xian noticed that Fei Jie used two titles, Count Sinan and Father. "I'm illegitimate." Fan Xian smiled sweetly. "According to the laws of this country, I shouldn't have the right to inherit my father's title. Concubines shouldn't be too worried about me. In this world, what can be said with certainty?" Fei Jie replied casually. "Although Sir Wu has been secretly protecting you, he can't be your nanny. The poison in your food can't kill him, but it can easily kill you. And you don't know how many people will die with you if you die." Fan Xian was more and more confused. He wondered what kind of power his father, whom he had never met, wielded in secret. It was obvious that his father had far more power and ability than a mere count could have. In the early morning light, Fei Jie held Fan Xian's little hand as they walked toward Danzhou. Their shadows, one tall and one short, stretched out on the ground. Fei Jie looked at Fan Xian's still pale face. "Actually, a dead person is the least scary thing." "Yes." In the future, don't use that kind of zhenqi to control your emotions. If you can't properly vent your emotions, even if your internal tyrannical zhenqi is cultivated to its peak, you'll only become a murderous monster. Yes. Fan Xian obediently dispersed the zhenqi in his body, no longer trying to control his fear and disgust of corpses. At that moment, Fei Jie suddenly said, "There's still a piece of rotten intestine in your sleeve. Are you going to braise it at home?" A child's scream and the sinister laughter of a bad teacher came from the quiet countryside. Chapter 10. In the following year, the young Fan Xian began to learn everything he could about poisons from Fei Jie, who had come from the capital. Occasionally, he would leave the city, traverse mountains and ravines in search of botanical poisons such as strychnine and Barbados nut. He also tasted all sorts of fungi, and suffered from stomach aches countless times. Were it not for the poison grandmaster at his side, he would have long since gone to the underworld. Of course, in order to further his studies, under Fei Jie's guidance, Count Sinan's illegitimate son had already committed numerous murders. Countless white rabbits with short tails and scurrying toads were buried under his delicate hands. That year, Fan Xian was 5 years old. Strangely, after Fei Jie's arrival in Danzhou, Wu Zhu, who lived in the grocery store, no longer deliberately avoided Fan Xian. At least, whenever Fan Xian snuck into the grocery store to drink alcohol that no child could drink, Wu Zhu would always make him a few side dishes to eat. Fan Xian sometimes found it strange. Wu Zhu was his mother's servant, so why didn't he even care that he drank? Fan Xian knew that his mother was no ordinary person, which was why she had such a loyal and powerful servant as Wu Zhu. But Fan Xian wasn't sure if this blind master would always stay by his side to watch over him. Unknowingly, Fan Xian had gradually gotten used to Wu Zhu watching over him from a short distance away. He had gotten used to the black cloth that covered Wu Zhu's eyes appearing from time to time in some corner, such as under a bamboo tree in an alley, next to a tofu stall on the street, and so on. During that year, the zhenqi in Fan Xian's body had been progressing slowly, but with abnormal stability. It was nearing a certain threshold, but the tyrannical zhenqi that he could accumulate in his sleep had become somewhat unstable, making his emotions faintly restless. He knew that in this still unfamiliar world, there were many unknown dangers. At least in Count Sinan's manor in the capital, there were certainly many problems that he did not understand. And as soon as he woke up, he set a goal for himself: live well and make progress every day. Because of this great goal, in order to preserve his life, and in order to carry out his 3 great missions in the future, he was very determined to practice. And because he had been unable to move due to his previous life's myasthenia gravis, he was suddenly able to walk freely in this life. This made Fan Xian cherish this ability even more. Every day, he would get up early in the morning to exercise, climbing high and low. He was so diligent that even Fei Jie found it terrifying. It was a pity that he could not find a way to practice magic. He was certainly more industrious than any other child, but he often comforted himself that as a young man of 20, he was certainly more industrious than the little slugs. Actually, no one knew that it wasn't that he could endure hardship. It was just that he had ADHD. After lying in bed for more than 10 years, even the laziest person wouldn't want to lie down again. That night, Mr. Fei Jie sat alone in his room. The light from the oil lamp had not yet dissipated. He leaned against the table, his white hair even darker than it had been when he first came to Danzhou. Now, he was writing on a piece of white paper with a quill. There was a knock on the door. Without turning his head, Fei Jie said quietly, "Come in." Fan Xian pushed the door open and stepped over the high threshold. Rubbing his head, he approached with a chuckle. "What are you writing, teacher?" Fei Jie didn't shy away from him. He casually pushed the paper aside, turned around, and asked, "What is it?" After spending a year with Count Sinan's illegitimate son, for some reason, this Overwatch Council toxicologist, who had terrorized countless officials and thieves, felt a sense of warmth in his heart. Looking at the kid, he was happy. The kid was young, but he could endure hardship and was willing to study hard. And he didn't have the pretentious aversion to poisons that the rest of the world did. This made Fei Jie feel very comfortable. And most importantly, Fan Xian was smart and sensible. Sometimes, he didn't even seem like a 5-year-old child. Teacher. Fan Xian moved his butt to the bench with some difficulty. I really want to know what kind of people my parents were. In fact, this was the 4th time Fan Xian had asked about Count Sinan and his mother's past in a year. But the first few times, Fei Jie had always been noncommittal. Your father was a very remarkable man, Fei Jie said. Of course, your mother was even more remarkable. His words were useless. The Overwatch Council was a terrifying place in the country responsible for investigating major cases, as well as major crimes committed by officials. Fei Jie was an early member of the council, and later became the head of the 3rd Bureau. He had always held a high position, and even in the capital, where there were hidden dragons and crouching tigers, he was feared. With a single word from Count Sinan, such a terrifying master of poisons had been banished to the faraway city of Danzhou to teach his illegitimate son. Even an idiot could tell how much power Count Sinan wielded in the capital, but it was unknown whether this power was official or whether it was hidden in the shadows. As for his mother, who had died on the day he was born, Fan Xian did not know what kind of woman she was, but his intuition told him that she was no ordinary woman. He did not know if it was because they were connected by blood, or for some other reason, but he had always felt that he missed that woman, whose name he did not know, whom he had never met. Fei Jie didn't seem to want to talk about it. Since the concubine has given birth to a son, he said indifferently, you can't inherit the count's estate in the future. So what do you plan to do? Fan Xian smiled sweetly. Teacher taught me how to use poison and how to detoxify it. In fact, I've learned a lot about medicine. If I can't do it in the future, I can become a doctor. Fei Jie stroked his long beard. That's only natural, he said proudly. Even the imperial physicians of the palace may not be better than me in medicine. As my only student, you are more than qualified to be a doctor in the future. Master and disciple said this, but deep down, they both knew that this was just an extravagant hope. Teacher, Fan Xian suddenly said, there seems to be a problem with the Zhenqi method I practice. I actually came here tonight to ask for your guidance. Fei Jie believed that no one in the world could surpass him when it came to using poison, but he had never been willing to teach Fan Xian anything else. A person's life is limited, but the methods of killing are limitless. So we should devote our limited life to the pursuit of the most powerful method of killing. And in Fei Jie's eyes, the most powerful method of killing was naturally poison. Now that Fan Xian had the best poison-using teacher, why would he need to practice Zhenqi? As for the magic that Fan Xian could never forget, Fei Jie, like most people of Qing, believed it to be of little use in battle. But this was the first time in a year that Fan Xian had taken the initiative to ask a question. Fei Jie couldn't help but feel curious. He stretched out 2 fingers and gently placed them on Fan Xian's pulse. He couldn't help but feel apprehensive. Chapter 11. Fei Jie slowly frowned. Because he believed in the blind man's power, he had never thought that there would be any problems with Fan Xian's Zhenqi. But today, when he checked Fan Xian's pulse, he found something unusual. Seeing his obscene teacher's serious face, Fan Xian knew something was wrong. He smiled and asked, "Is there a problem? You're smiling like that. Aren't you afraid of going mad?" Fei Jie glared at him. "Last time, I only knew that the Zhenqi you practiced was overbearing, but I didn't expect it to be this overbearing." Fan Xian scratched his head. "Overbearing? How overbearing! Fei Jie answered seriously, very overbearing. Fan Xian looked at him seriously. Teacher, we're both talking nonsense. Fei Jie was a master of poisons, not a grandmaster. Naturally, he couldn't tell what the nameless Zhenqi Fan Xian practiced was, but he could clearly feel the danger of the Zhenqi in the child's body. After thinking about it for a while, he advised Fan Xian to go find Wu Zhu. Unexpectedly, Fan Xian sighed and said that Wu Zhu had only listened to his mother and given him the book. Even he himself hadn't practiced it, so he wouldn't say anything. Fei Jie was furious. Master Wu is going too far. As his young master, why doesn't he teach you personally? Instead, he makes you learn this dangerous method without the guidance of a good teacher? For more than a year, he had long regarded the 5-year-old boy in front of him as the greatest source of comfort in his later years. He still hoped that Fan Xian would one day be able to inherit his mantle and carry forward what he had learned. So when he heard of this matter, he began to resent the blind Wu Zhu. Is Uncle Wu Zhu very powerful? Fan Xian asked, squinting like a little fox. Of course. Fei Jie thought about the past. But in this world, not many people know of Sir Wu's existence. Do you know of the 4 grandmasters? Of course Fan Xian knew. In today's world, the 4 martial superpowers worshipped by the common people were the 4 grandmasters. There were 2 in the kingdom of Qing, 1 in the kingdom of northern Qi, and 1 in the city of Dongyi. In the present world, the Qing kingdom, under the leadership of the emperor, had long obtained an overwhelming advantage. Strangely, after the bloodshed in the coup last year, the power of the country had recovered, but the emperor had instead laid down the flags and ceased to expand outward. However, it was natural for the most powerful country to have 2 super powerhouses. That's right, our country currently has 2 great grandmasters. Fei Jie sneered and said, people are stupid and stubborn. They only know how to fight. How would they know that once poison is perfected, they can also become a grandmaster? Fan Xian hurriedly coughed twice to stop his teacher from boasting. If we exclude the most mysterious temple of the 4 grandmasters, the kingdom of Qing has 2. One of them is the younger brother of the teacher of the current commander of the Jingdo garrison, Yi Luyun of the Flowing Cloud Sans Ho. Fan Xian's eyes widened, thinking that this was a bit long, but the Jingdo garrison was responsible for the safety of the entire capital. It was the most important position in the world. That teacher's brother, Yi Luyun, was probably very strong. There is another expert. I heard that he is in the imperial palace, but no one has seen him. Hey teacher, we're talking about Uncle Wu Zhu. What's the rush? Fei Jie stared at him. Yi Luyun has fought 17 duels in his life and never lost once. But when your mother first came to the capital, because she beat up Yi Luyun's nephew, who is now the commander of the Jingdo garrison, into a pig's head, Yi Luyun spread the word that he was going to make trouble for your mother. Fan Xian was dumbfounded. His mother, whom he had never met, was also an arrogant character back in the day. Fei Jie chuckled and said, but later, for some reason, Yi Luyun suddenly stopped caring about this matter. Yi Zhong even went to Taiping courtyard to serve tea to your mother and apologize. No one knows what happened. This matter has always been very mysterious. But it should be that Yi Luyun and Sir Wu Zhu fought under the palace walls. Sir Wu Zhu was your mother's servant, so it was normal for him to stand up for something like this. Fei Jie picked up the cup of tea beside him and took a sip. Who won in the end? Fan Xian's eyes were wide with curiosity. Although he knew that the blind Wu Zhu was a powerful fighter, he did not expect him to have the experience of fighting Yi Luyun, one of the 4 great grandmasters. No one knows the result, but it should have been a draw. Fei Jie frowned and said, I heard that after Yi Luyun returned to his sword pavilion, he trained with a black cloth for half a year. It was after that he abandoned the sword and developed a set of simple, unadorned sans ho. Only then did he truly become a grandmaster. I think that battle must have inspired him a lot. He propped up his face and thought, 4 great grandmasters? Then 5th Zhu was ranked 5th. Did that mean he was the 5th great grandmaster? Fan Xian's eyes shone like peach blossoms. It turned out that his blind servant was so powerful. In the future, when he ventured into the world, who would he have to be afraid of? Suddenly, he thought of a question. Teacher, didn't you say that these things are all secrets? How did you know? Fei Jie said coldly, I am a high-ranking official of the Overwatch Council. To us, there are no secrets in this world. For some reason, Fan Xian had always been particularly interested in the powerful figures of this world. It was as if he felt that after a decade or so, he would eventually meet those people. So he opened his mouth and asked, Have you met the other 3 great grandmasters? The other master of the kingdom of Qing only exists in legends. According to analysis, he should be in the palace, but no one has actually met him. Fei Jie said, As for the peerless master of the kingdom of Northern Qi, it is naturally their imperial advisor, that perverted bald Ku He. Bald? Fan Xian remembered that there was no Buddhism in this world, so naturally there were no monks. He was a monk. I heard that Ku He was an ascetic monk. He once knelt in front of the bluestone steps of the temple for 3 months, drinking only cold food and dew. For some reason, he moved the people in the temple. Just like that, he received the gift of God and became a great grandmaster. Fei Jie cursed. It seemed that he envied the ascetic monk named Ku He. One look and you could tell that the bald man was a liar. Temple. Temple. It is a temple dedicated to the gods. Teacher, you're talking nonsense again. The temple is the most mysterious place in the entire continent. It is said that it is the place where the ancestors worship the god. Unfortunately, other than a few extremely lucky bastards, no one has been able to find out where the temple is. So no one knows what it is like inside. Then perhaps, the temple does not exist. Fei Jie hit Fan Xian's little head hard. It is one thing to mess around normally, but how can you be so disrespectful to such a holy and noble place? Fan Xian held his head and looked at his teacher in shock. First, he was shocked that his teacher, who had used poison without blinking an eye, would still maintain respect for the temple. Second, he found that he had easily accepted the 4 great grandmasters and the temple, which seemed to be a bit strange. It seemed that he really had adapted to this world. Chapter 12. Who has proof that the temple really exists? Fan Xian still retained the spirit of a modern person. Fei Jie said proudly, Imperial Advisor Ku He, one of the 4 great grandmasters, was only favored by the temple and became the most powerful warrior in the land. Is that not enough proof? Perhaps Ku He took a lot of stimulants and used the temple as an excuse. Fan Xian pursed his lips. Bah, although I am very jealous of Ku He's luck, he has been worshipping the gods for decades. I admire that. How could he use the temple as an excuse? Besides, what is a stimulant? It's a kind of tonic, like an elixir. It must have been too much, otherwise how could he have lost all his hair? Fan Xian laughed and joked with his teacher. Fei Jie ignored him. The temple and the Tianmai are the same. They are both things that are recorded in ancient books. The most important part of the royal worship is the worship of the temple. However, the temple does not want to interfere with worldly affairs and never enters the world, so the worship is only held in the Temple of Heaven, 3 miles away from the royal palace. The temples of Qing and Northern Qi both have the great priests of the temple, but they never get involved in politics or national affairs. Only some ascetic monks are said to be remnants of the temple, and they walk the world to train their bodies and minds. Fan Xian was still smiling, but in his heart, he was thinking, what kind of existence is the temple? If it is a religion, why is there no existence similar to a church in this world? If there is no such organization, then this religion has no power. Without power there is no profit. Without profit there is no reason for any organization to exist. So he did not believe that the temple was, as Teacher Fei said, just a transcendent existence that is detached from the world. But in his heart he also thought, if there really is such a miraculous place to worship and it does not interfere with human life, it seems to be a good thing. All right, teacher, you have been chatting for a long time, but you still haven't told me what is going on with the Jinqi in my body. Seeing the boy throw a rare tantrum, Fei Jie carefully felt his pulse and then said seriously, as I said earlier, the Jinqi in your body is very powerful. So powerful that, although you have only been training for a short time, the amount of Jinqi in your dantian and meridians far exceeds what your body can hold at your age. Is it that serious? Fan Xian's face was bitter. I have not confirmed it yet. Then you're trying to scare me in advance. I'm not trying to scare you. It's just that right now you're like a leather bag filled with wine. The bag is only so big, and the wine inside is getting more and more. If you continue to practice like this, I'm worried that your leather bag will burst. Fan Xian had been practicing martial arts for the past few days. Other than the occasional burning pain in his waist, he had not felt anything strange. So when he heard his teacher say this, he could not help but feel a bit reluctant to believe it. He shook his head and said, Teacher, you are calling me a good-for-nothing. I understand what you mean. Try to circulate the genuine qi in your body according to your usual cultivation method. Fei Jie frowned slightly. Fan Xian obeyed and closed his eyes. Naturally, he entered a state of cultivation. The warm mass of qi in his abdomen began to gradually expand. It followed the meridians of his body and slowly spread to his limbs. Fei Jie closed his eyes and placed his fingertips on the little fellow's wrist. After a while, he suddenly frowned and said, Don't hold it back on purpose. You're just a 5-year-old child. Even if the genuine qi is too overbearing, it can't hurt me. It's just that your body is weak now and can't bear it. Fan Xian had indeed been controlling the strength of the genuine qi in his body, slowly releasing it from his dantian. But now that he heard his teacher's words, he thought that the little bit of genuine qi he had could not hurt this old poisonous creature. If he released too little genuine qi, it would be difficult for his teacher to detect the true symptoms. Thinking this, he closed his eyes. The nameless Jinqi formula slowly rang out in his mind. Do not destroy the shape of the pool of flowers. Let the heavenly spring pour into your body. As he recited the formula, the genuine qi in his body seemed to have received an order. It jumped and happily ran out of his dantian. It followed the meridians of his abdomen to his back and followed a very strange path straight to his wrist. A muffled sound rang out in the study. Fei Jie suddenly opened his eyes and felt his fingers on the child's wrist being flicked by a thick stream of Jinqi. He wasn't prepared and was forcefully flung into the wall. With a muffled sound, he felt a burning sensation in his fingers and a pain in his chest. Unexpectedly, he spat out a mouthful of blood. On the other side, Fan Xian also felt a pain in his chest. He raised his head and saw Fei Jie's wretched appearance. Shocked, he hurriedly ran forward and helped his teacher up. Fei Jie waved his hand, indicating that he was fine. He climbed up from the floor and touched the blood stain at the side of his lip. He looked at the child with a strange look in his eyes, one that he could not quite put into words. He muttered to himself, He's only King 5 years old. How can his genuine qi be so overbearing? If you continue to train, won't the genuine qi in your body explode in the future? Hearing his teacher curse, Fan Xian was stunned. He had not expected Fei Jie to spit out blood from the sudden disobedience of the genuine qi in his wrist. But after Fei Jie was injured, the first thing he thought of was not his own injury, but his concern for his student's safety. Thinking of this, even Fan Xian, who had always hidden in the shell of a child, and sometimes deliberately sealed off his emotions, felt moved. The wooden door opened without any wind, and a black shadow swept in like a black light. Fan Xian was very familiar with this person's scent, so he did not pay much attention to him. He only helped Fei Jie. "You two fools!" Even at a time like this, the blind Wu Zhu's tone was as cold as ever. He lifted Fan Xian up with one hand and put his finger on the child's neck. After a moment, he said coldly, "You are not injured. You were just too nervous when you saw Fei Jie spit out blood." He then looked at Fei Jie and said coldly, "Fei Jie, you taught him how to use poison. I trust your ability, but the lady once said that your level of martial arts is the weakest of the 8 bureaus of the capital. Since this is something I left for the young master, it would be best if you did not say anything." In Danzhou City, Fei Jie seemed to be a very unremarkable and somewhat wretched teacher. But in the capital, he was a very powerful figure. Now that he was injured, although he had been careless, Wu Zhu's words made him feel ashamed. Furthermore, he was worried that Fan Xian, who was only 5 years old, would begin to practice such an overbearing method. His face gradually darkened. Chapter 13. Fei Jie's face darkened. Of course I have no right to question the method Master Wu Zhu taught Fan Xian. But I am curious, why didn't you teach him yourself? After all, he is only 5 years old. Even if he is talented, as his mother's servant, you should be watching from the side in such a dangerous situation. What he said made sense. Since Wu Zhu had left this nameless Jinqi formula next to Fan Xian's swaddling clothes, he had a duty to ensure that Fan Xian would not have any problems practicing it. Fan Xian looked at Wu Zhu awkwardly, but his eyes were fixed on the black cloth that covered Wu Zhu's eyes. Wu Zhu slowly opened his mouth. "I didn't leave this for the young master. The young lady left it for him." Mechanical. Fei Jie didn't want to offend this blind man, but now he had to be ruthless. "Your cultivation is so high. Just a few words of advice and Fan Xian wouldn't have to practice so dangerously." Wu Zhu paused, then suddenly said, "I have never practiced Jinqi." Having said that, he turned and left, leaving the stupefied master and disciple in the room. What did he just say? He said he had never practiced Jinqi, and the 2 words he said seemed to have gone through a lot. Fei Jie looked at Fan Xian, who was pretending to be mature, and he was filled with anger. He couldn't figure out where this 5-year-old kid had learned to say such dry, witty things. It is hard to imagine that someone without internal energy could fight Luyun Sanzhou, one of the 4 great grandmasters, to a draw. Although Yi Luyun was still using a sword at the time, he had not mastered the Sanzhou. "Teacher," Fan Xian asked respectfully, "can a person without internal Jinqi be as powerful as Uncle Wu Zhu?" Fei Jie frowned and thought for a moment. Only if his every movement was terrifyingly precise could he use the iron rod in his hand and stab it into his opponent's vitals before they could react. Fan Xian remembered the night when he had first arrived in this world. The blind young man had carried him on his back and held a dripping iron rod in his hand. However, this kind of speed and power shouldn't be something a human can achieve. Fei Jie shook his head and suddenly coughed twice. He hurriedly sat down at the desk and looked at Fan Xian seriously. "Kid, if you don't have to practice this martial art, it's best if you don't. With what I've taught you, I can guarantee that in the future, only others will be afraid of you." "I will think about it, teacher," Fan Xian replied maturely. Fei Jie thought for a moment, then went to the bedside and fetched a small medicine pouch. He handed it to Fan Xian. "Take it. This medicine is very expensive. If in the future your training goes awry, remember to take one, and drink it with plenty of water." Fan Xian held the pouch in his hand. He knew that this medicine must be very precious. He nodded. "Thank you for the medicine, master." Fei Jie smiled and looked at the child in front of him who was like a little adult. He suddenly said, "Is it strange? I was clearly forced by your father to come to Danzhou to teach you. Why am I still so good to you now?" Fan Xian did not open his mouth to speak. He only looked at him with a grateful expression. Fei Jie smiled and shook his head. He patted Fan Xian's head. "Perhaps I'm getting old. To be able to teach such a clever student like you is something to be happy about. For now, don't think about the Count's manor in the capital," Fei Jie said seriously. "Although you are still young, I hope you remember what I'm about to say." Seeing that his teacher was being serious, Fan Xian quickly stood up and listened. "The affairs of your family are far more complicated than you can imagine. It involves not only your own survival, but also the lives of many others. So you must be careful. In the years before you grow up, you must learn to protect yourself. That way, in the future, you will have the power to protect others." "In the future, who will I protect?" Fan Xian was a little confused. Fei Jie smiled and pointed at his nose. "For example, people like me, who are already inextricably linked to you." Fan Xian nodded, not really understanding. In his heart, he thought that this matter really was quite complicated. He had lived 2 lives, and he still couldn't understand what these old comrades were playing at. "All right, go back to your room. Remember to take care of yourself. It's best if you don't practice that evil tyrannical kung fu." Fan Xian obediently returned to his room. As soon as he entered, he saw Wu Zhu sitting quietly in a corner. There was no light and it was gloomy. The black cloth covering his eyes was even thicker than the darkness of the night, like ink. "Uncle." Fan Xian bowed his head in greeting. Wu Zhu's voice came from the corner. It was flat and clear. "The book is divided into 2 volumes. The first volume is called Tyrannical, and the second volume has no name. This is the book the lady left for you. So when you were young, I kept it by your side. I have never practiced these martial arts, so I cannot teach you. But I believe that since it is called the tyrannical volume, it is normal for it to be a bit tyrannical. If there is a problem with it, it is your own problem." Having said this, the black cloth disappeared from Fan Xian's eyes. What a simple and crude explanation. What an indifferent and strange person. Fan Xian sighed and climbed into bed. From a secret compartment, he took out the nameless book, calculating in his heart. Actually, in the process of practicing martial arts, he had discovered that after the Jinqi filled his dantian, it did not flow through his meridians as he wished. Instead, a portion of it went against the path of the virtual manor and poured directly into the snow mountain pass above his kidney. The snow mountain pass passed through the spine. Whether it was in his previous life or this one, Fan Xian knew that the nerves there led directly to the brain. It was the most important part of the human body. The slightest carelessness could cripple a person and leave him bedridden. But Fan Xian's daily afternoon naps and meditation, and the tyrannical Jinqi in his body passed through the snow mountain pass in his lower back, would become much calmer. The feeling of irritation would also disappear. Instead, he would feel completely comfortable, like eating ice cream in summer. Since he was 1, he had been practicing like this. Could it be that he had been practicing it wrong from the beginning? Fan Xian did not have the confidence to walk a crooked path on the road of martial arts in this world, but he was like a person who drank a dove to quench his thirst. He could no longer break free from the shackles of this happiness. If he stopped practicing now, the tyrannical Jinqi in his body would one day break through his stinky skin. The blind Wu Zhu said that if he could not practice it, it was Fan Xian's own problem. But now Fan Xian was thinking, to practice or not to practice, that was the real question. Chapter 14. Early in the morning, birds chirped in the garden. The maids and servants in the mansion finished cleaning and began to prepare breakfast. Now that Count Sinan's daughter, Fan Ruoro, had returned to the capital, There was only 1.5 left in the manor. After everything was done, the head maid, Donger, went to wake Fan Xian up. She was shocked to see Fan Xian, thinking that he was seriously ill. She hurriedly went to fetch a doctor, but when the doctor arrived, he took his pulse and said that there was nothing wrong with him. It was just that he had eaten something recently that made him a little hot. He wrote a few prescriptions for him to recuperate, then took the money and left. Ever since Fei Jie had arrived at the Count's manor, the teacher, who had been a fan of ancient literature, had quietly left. As the morning breeze blew in, Fei Jie looked at the little boy in front of him, who had 2 dark circles under his eyes. He laughed shrilly. People say that young people are like the rising sun, ignorant of the sorrows of the world. What have you been up to? You can't even sleep well, and you even have to call a doctor. Fan Xian had thought about it all night, but he still hadn't decided whether or not he should cultivate the jinqi in his body. Although his nature was to practice this nameless martial art as a form of entertainment, when it came to matters of life and death, he naturally had to be careful. Having slept too little, he was already in a trance. When he heard Teacher Fei say that he didn't know the sorrows of the world, he unconsciously groaned. Young people don't know the sorrows of the world and love to go up. Love to go up, and for the sake of new words, talk about sorrows. Now that he knows the sorrows of the world, he stops talking. He stops talking, only to realize that it's a cool autumn day. The study was suddenly quiet, and not a sound could be heard for a long time. Fan Xian pushed his sleepy eyelids open and yawned. "Teacher, I slept too late last night. Don't be angry." Fei Jie looked at him and unconsciously reached out to stroke his beard. Unexpectedly, he was still holding the quill in his hand, and when it struck his chin, the pain woke him up. "Just now, those words, who wrote them?" he asked. "Poor old Exin." Fan Xian didn't even think about it and directly said Xian Qiji's name. Only now did he realize what kind of mistake he had made. Seeing the green light in Fei Jie's eyes, Fan Xian stuttered, "Lao Xian is a middleman who came to the west of the city last month to collect sea salt." "Oh, it's well written. I wonder what the name of a merchant is." "Xian Qiji." Fan Xian stole a glance at him. Fei Jie's expression had already returned to normal, and the class began. Apart from the introduction to biological poisons, he also had to teach other subjects, so the teaching task was a little heavy. After lunch and returning to his bedroom, Fan Xian finally began to face that complicated question. Should he practice that overbearing and dangerous jinqi or not? He held the yellow book in his hand and began to worry. But before that, the first thing he had to worry about was the words he had accidentally practiced in the study. "Ugly Slave" was a poem written by Xian Qiji after he was demoted. Fan Xian was very familiar with it, but he recited it casually. He had no idea how much trouble it would bring him, but he didn't know if he had fooled Fei Jie with the story he had just come up with. But judging by Fei Jie's expression, he must have believed it. The original author was a sea salt merchant. Fan Xian wasn't a clean freak, and he didn't think it was disgusting to plagiarize the works of others. In his opinion, since these poems were things that only he knew, it would be a waste if he didn't make use of them. In the first few years after he came to this world, he had enough time to think about how to survive in this world. Plagiarism, a job with a bright future, was one of his plans without hesitation, and it firmly occupied the top 3 positions of glory. When Fan Xian was thinking about this part, he kept hypnotizing himself. "I'm not yeast, I'm the disseminator of Earth's cultural heritage, the preserver, the great communitarian." But he didn't want to copy like this, not now. In his imagination, at least whatever he wrote, he had to use the names of his ancestors as his pen names. Just like today in the study. If a 5-year-old child wanted to copy, he should copy Luo Binwang's "White feather floats on green water, goose goose, goose goose." That was so cheerful, in line with the child prodigy in his plan. And at such a young age, if he were to casually hum, "What's left to say? What a cool autumn day!" that kind of phrase would no longer be a child prodigy, but a heavenly mountain maiden. He looked young on the outside, but inside there were 365 cracks. Each crack had the 4 words spring, summer, autumn, and winter written on it. As Fan Xian thought about these trivial matters, he followed his biological clock, which had been as stable as a mountain, and fell into a deep sleep. In his dreams, he began to meditate and practice the zhenqi that Fei Jie saw as incomparably dangerous and tyrannical. It was from this day on that Fan Xian accepted his fate. Since sleeping was practice, then he would practice. He would think about it when he actually exploded. While Fan Xian was taking his afternoon nap, Fei Jie was in his room writing the letter he hadn't finished the night before. There were a few lines of dried handwriting on the paper, probably left over from last night. This child is more beautiful than others, more courageous than others, more intelligent than others, more determined than others, and more mature than others. If all the 5-year-old boys in the kingdom of Qing were to stand together, he would certainly hide at the back of the crowd, but he would also be the fastest to be discovered. Judging from this year's interaction, he is the most suitable person to inherit Master's family property. It's a pity that his identity is the biggest problem. The writing ended here. It was at this point that Fan Xian began to ask him about zhenqi. Fei Jie sighed and thought of the lines he had heard Fan Xian recite in the study that morning. He composed himself and continued to write on the paper. "I want to say something, but don't stop. It's a cool autumn day. In recent years, ancient literature has been declining, and modern literature has taken over. It's hard to believe that this came from the mouth of a 5-year-old boy, and it's hard to believe that it was written by a merchant." Furthermore, when the young master replied, there was a hint of panic in his eyes. "This is something I have rarely seen in our year of interaction. The biggest problem is that I have been with him every day, and I don't even know when Xian Qiji secretly met with him." At the end of the letter, he solemnly wrote, "Have the people of Dongshan Road investigate who that sea salt merchant named Xian Qiji is, and why he was in contact with the young master." Why did the young master panic because of these words? This is an urgent matter. Do it quickly. After writing his distorted signature, Fei Jie put down his pen. A few days later, the capital's Overwatch Council began to send out secret agents to search for a sea salt merchant. In the end, they found a number of illegal salt traffickers and toppled a number of high-ranking officials in the eastern part of the kingdom of Qing. The results were remarkable, but they still couldn't find the merchant named Xian. According to the rumors in the capital, Director Chern of the Overwatch Council, who was feared by the entire world, was furious because of this matter. The entire council was fined for 3 months, and the secret agents searched all over the world. God bless this world with a pitiful man named Xian Qiji. Chapter 15. Another autumn came, and chrysanthemums floated all over the mountain. Fei Jie's teaching career in Danzhou was supposed to end in the summer, but Mr. Fei liked the air and sea breeze of Danzhou. He liked the food at Count Sinan's estate, and he really liked the child he was teaching. So he dragged it on for a few more months. A few months later, Sir Fei, who was adept at poisoning people to death, and who was naturally adept at making the elderly live longer, rubbed his belly, which was growing rounder by the day. He regretfully received a letter from the capital, and reluctantly took his leave from Count Sinan's old mother. The Countess knew that the teacher before her had been sent by someone from the capital. She comforted him, but did not try to keep him. She gave him a thick red envelope, thanked him, and left. On the road west of Danzhou Harbor, teacher and student were having a conversation before they parted. "Why do you not listen to me when I tell you not to practice that explosive zhenqi? Teacher, at least for now, I don't see any major problems. If there are no problems, then last night when you went to the kitchen to steal some wine, why did you break the entire urn? It was an accident, Fan Xian answered, distressed. Over the past few months, the zhenqi in his body had become more and more violent, and this kind of thing happened often. It had caused little Fan Xian to not tell ghost stories in bed with the serving girls for many days, because he was afraid that when everyone was huddled together, he would make an unforgivable mistake and ruin the flower. When you learn how to use poison, you learn the most powerful killing method in the world. Why do you still need to learn that? Because using poison can easily hurt innocent people. Fei Jie suddenly stared into the boy's eyes. Are you sure you're not even 6 years old this year? Fan Xian looked at his teacher innocently. It's not my fault that I'm precocious. Fei Jie exhaled and spat. It was not easy for him to spend so much time with this little freak without losing his mind. It was time to part. Fei Jie stroked the little fellow's head and turned his head to look at Danzhou behind him. The harbor was displaying its beauty against the backdrop of the blue sea and blue sky. If you really want to come to the capital in the future, to become a doctor, remember to look for me. Yes. Fan Xian bowed respectfully. He was truly grateful to the strange old man in front of him. The blind Wu Zhu had always been so cold. All these years, the adult soul in the child's body had found someone to talk to. Even if the other was his teacher, and his background was not simple, he was still grateful. Furthermore, after more than a year of interaction, he could feel that the old man had become more protective of him. Don't learn that zhenqi anymore. Teacher, you are really long-winded. Maybe it's because he's too old. Fei Jie rubbed Fan Xian's soft black hand on his head with one hand and stroked his own messy white hair with the other. However, that true qi is indeed useless. It's too powerful and uncontrollable. Fei Jie did not give up. That sword-wielding monster in Dongyi owes me a favor. If you are willing, I can introduce you to him as a student. Fan Xian sucked in a cold breath and said, You're talking about the sword saint of Dongyi? That's right, Fei Jie said temptingly. One of the 4 grandmasters. No matter what you practice is better than what you practice. Fan Xian was interested in something else. Teacher, how did you know him? Oh, when he was 8, his father invited me to treat him. TSK, that monster was clearly an idiot. All he could do was hug a tree branch and stare blankly. I casually treated him, and after a few years, I heard that he actually learned the Sigu swordsmanship and became a grandmaster. Fan Xian looked at him with disdain. Casually treated him? Let's not talk about you swindling medical fees. Just the fact that you almost killed a future peerless master is enough to make you look down on. Feigning anger, Fei Jie strode toward the carriage in the distance. As he walked, he said, I've taught you the basics of biological poisons and the basics of related knowledge. But there is one most important thing I haven't told you yet. Fan Xian scampered along, his calves like wind and fire wheels. He followed behind his teacher. What is it? Detoxification is not difficult, nor is concocting the poison. The most difficult thing is to poison it. Fei Jie walked on without turning his head. Fan Xian stopped in his tracks, thinking carefully about what Fei Jie had just said. Having studied poison with Fei Jie for a year, he knew how difficult it was to find a colorless, odorless, and tasteless poison in this world. So the key was the word poison. Fan Xian suddenly laughed shyly. He wasn't going to become an assassin, nor was he going to the palace to poison the emperor. What was the point of worrying about such things? He just had to make sure that Count Sinan's concubine in the capital couldn't find someone to poison him. After following Fei Jie for a year, he was confident. Fan Xian watched the carriage slowly move away, dust rising as it slowly landed by the roadside. He bowed to the carriage on the road. He knew that the perverted old man in the carriage must have been very reluctant to come to Danzhou. But over the past year, Fan Xian had followed him everywhere to dig up corpses and cut frog legs. He couldn't help but be infected with some of the old man's dark aura, and felt that he could be considered a friend despite the difference in age. Fan Xian couldn't help but feel a little sad when he left like this. Teacher Fei Jie is really a good person, but he's a little pitiful. For a long time after that, Fan Xian couldn't get used to it. Normally, when young noblemen were his age, they would gather friends to learn and have fun. Although Fan Xian was the only noble in Danzhou Port, he could still find many playmates who were close to his age. However, Fan Xian knew that after he ended the story club, he could no longer hang out with his peers anymore. Because his mental age was much older than the other parties, he felt like he was taking care of a child when he was with those children. Not everyone was willing to be the king of children to satisfy their petty desire for power. Even in the original world, there were not many men who would be willing to go to kindergarten to be a teacher. This was the same logic. Teacher Fei Jie left Danzhou Harbor and lost the only person he could communicate with. He felt that his life had become boring. He stood in front of the count's mansion, watching the people coming and going on the road. He felt a little lonely, not knowing what he would do in the future, nestled in the body of a little child. He thought about the wonderful things he had fantasized about when he first woke up, and couldn't help but laugh at himself. In his previous life, he had spent most of his time in a sickbed, and his ability level made his transmigration seem particularly pitiful. But he had thought that he was more capable than the people of this world, such as being able to make a few bars of soap, make a few ugly glasses, and come up with a few simple ideas that would bring him many benefits. But when Fan Xian found out that soap and glass had long existed in this world, Fei Jie had left Danzhou Harbor in a four-wheeled carriage. When he found out that the horse of the guard next to the carriage had a saddle and stirrup, he felt a sense of failure and began to sigh. Chapter 16. The sky above Danzhou suddenly darkened. The black clouds above their heads were heavy like wet, dirty cotton or overheated cotton candy. They hung above everyone's heads. But the people who lived by the sea were used to this kind of weather. They knew that there was still a long time before it started to rain, so they didn't panic. It wasn't like years ago, when Count Sinan's beautiful illegitimate son liked to run to the rooftops of the manor's courtyards and yell to the whole city, "It's going to rain. Everyone, put away your clothes." "Young Master Fan, why don't you tell everyone to put away their clothes?" On the only main street in Danzhou Harbor, there were food and trinkets everywhere. The peddlers looked at the handsome boy walking through the crowd and joked. Fan Xian smiled shyly and didn't say anything. He held the hand of a serving girl and walked into the manor, holding a piece of tofu in his other hand. Everyone knew that this illegitimate son of Count Sinan was different from other young nobles. He liked to help the servants, especially the serving girls. They were used to it, so they weren't surprised. It had been nearly 6 years since Fei Jie left Danzhou, and Fan Xian had grown into a calm and beautiful young boy. Returning to the manor, Fan Xian asked the servants to take the tofu to the kitchen, then paid his respects to the ill countess and tucked a piece of paper into his clothes. Only then did he return to his study. He took out the letter from his sister in the capital and placed it next to the paper. The expression on his face suddenly became interesting. This year, the emperor of the kingdom of Qing had surprised everyone by changing the Qing calendar. The name of the year was the same as the name of the country. Although the civil officials and nobles in the capital didn't dare to express any opinions, they would always mutter a few words in a corner where no one was around. This was especially true for the pedantic literati. Whether it was the modern or the ancient literati, the old masters of the National Academy of Education or the novelists who ate porridge, they all began to voice their opinions in the articles submitted to the 8th Bureau of the Overwatch Council for review. After the change of the Qing calendar came the implementation of new policies. But the new policies seemed to be nothing new. They only regulated the governance of the officials. The only thing that struck the people as new was that in the first year of the Qin calendar, the palace suddenly issued an edict. The internal court began to publish newspapers. Newspaper? No one understood what it was until the internal court actually printed the first piece of newspaper. Only then did everyone exclaim in unison. No one took it seriously anymore. Because this newspaper was a product exclusively controlled by the royal palace, and the daily sample issue had to be approved by His Majesty himself before it could be printed, it was impossible to publish any articles that would cause trouble for the empire. After a few issues of the newspaper, which cost 1 silver coin each, were bought by the people in the capital who loved to try new things. Some of the nobles felt that they had been tricked by His Majesty. Was the palace preparing to build a new garden? There was nothing of value on that thin piece of paper. It only wrote about various places of interest and biographies of people from the previous dynasty. On the side that took up the largest space, there were flower-like borders printed around it. They recorded the private lives of many officials in Jingdo, such as how the head of the military council was brutally beaten by his fierce wife, why the commander of the Jingdo garrison was missing a front tooth, and so on. There was also some gossip involving neighboring northern Qi and Dongyi, but the officials of the Qin kingdom only paid attention to their own matters. In the beginning they could laugh and laugh. Later, when it was their turn, they knew the taste of losing face. They had wanted to make trouble for the newspaper, but the emperor was behind them, so they could only reluctantly give up. The newspaper had a small print run. There were only 2 copies in all of Danzhou. One of them was for the count's estate. When Fan Xian stole the newspaper that the servants were talking about from his grandmother's room and hurriedly scanned it, he was unable to control the expression on his face. He opened his mouth wide and wished he could stuff his fist into it. What era was this? There was a gossip newspaper, and it was supervised by an imperial edict. There was another new policy. The royal family had issued the Open Postal Act. Nowadays, postal routes were unimpeded. This way, the brother and sister could quietly communicate without fear of others finding out. Fan Xian frowned as he looked at the newspaper in front of him. During this time, he had heard many things about the new policy from passers-by. In his opinion, it was purely a product of the emperor's mischief. But everyone knew that the emperor had never been one to make trouble. Fan Xian was not in the mood to change the world, nor did he have any interest in changing it. But when some aspects of the world had become similar to his previous world, he naturally wanted to know what was hidden behind these things. After this awkward thought process, he still couldn't figure it out. He smiled bitterly and pushed the newspaper aside. He thought to himself, could it be that there's another person in this world who has traveled through time and one who is especially ambitious? But none of this had anything to do with him. The letter next to the newspaper was inextricably linked to him. In Fan Xian's memory, Fan Ruoro was the one who was related to him by blood. Many years ago, he had spent a short period of his childhood in Danzhou. She was tanned and skinny, and she was not even as beautiful as he was. He hadn't seen her for many years, and he didn't know what she looked like now. Had the sparse yellow hair on her head turned black? Had she become prettier? Fan Xian had even forgotten whether his sister should be called Fan Rua or Fan Ruoro. I really am not a good brother, he thought self-mockingly. Even though he had a strange soul that had lived 2 lives in his body, he was still that girl's brother in his blood, so he did not care much for her. 2 years ago, when Fan Ruoro started school, she often sent letters from school to Danzhou City. Fan Xian, on the other hand, spent every day practicing his powerful jinqi, receiving hard training from the blind Wu Zhu, and revising the book on toxicology left behind by Fei Jie, rarely replied. Fan Ruoro should have been 10 years old this year. Perhaps it was because of the horror stories she had read in her childhood, but for some reason, the young lady of the Count's manor was very dependent on her distant brother. She often sent letters to ask after him. In the first half of the year, her letters often expressed her longing for her grandmother and memories of her life in Danjo. In the second half of the year, her letters only occasionally talked about family matters, and most of them talked about the boring days in the capital. Fan Xian's finger lightly brushed across the letter, his beautiful face slightly worried. The letter was written in his sister's slightly immature handwriting. She wrote about her recent life in the capital, and how she had entered a school that only girls from noble families could attend. Everything seemed to fit the trajectory that everyone like her should follow. Chapter 17. But between the lines of the letter, there was always a hint of worry that did not match Fan Ruoro's age. Thinking about it, the concubine who had given birth to a son had become more and more arrogant after the death of the First Lady. The little girl was alone in the capital, and Count Sinan was busy with official business. Perhaps there were some problems with her life. Fan Xian picked up his brush and dipped it in ink. After a moment's thought, he began to write. In the letter, he was very vague. He wanted his sister to spend more time with Count Sinan, and to appear weak and lovely in front of their father. She should never complain, but she should occasionally show her hidden bitterness. The second step was to show off her strength in front of the concubine and her arrogant younger brother. As the saying goes, a kind person can be bullied. If you don't want to be bullied, you have to at least show that you have the will to resist. The third step was to treat the servants in the family better, especially Count Sinan's aides. She had to look at the uncle with pure, innocent eyes, and look at him with idle admiration. After that, she had to offend the current mistress of the capital, suffer a little, and then find a way to let the master know. Any man would have an inexplicable desire to protect someone, especially his own daughter. He believed that under the influence of his surroundings, Count Sinan would remember that his dead wife had left him a daughter. But this kind of family strategy needed to be mastered. Fan Xian casually gave a few pointers, thinking that if Ruoro was smart enough, she would understand what he meant. But he didn't know if these tricks, which he had learned from the romance novels of his previous life, would be useful. He waited anxiously for a reply, afraid that his blind suggestions would bring trouble to the 11-year-old girl. After 2 months, Fan Ruoro's reply came. He didn't know if it was because of these tricks, or if there was no such thing as a stepmother abusing her daughter in the capital, but Fan Xian could clearly see that his sister was very happy. But in the letter, Fan Ruoro asked, puzzled, why should he treat the servants in the family better? Only then did Fan Xian realize that in such a stratified society, not everyone saw the relationship between people the way he did. So he wrote another letter, and told a few short stories to show that respect was not only good for others, but good for oneself as well. Originally, Fan Xian had wanted to copy a few stories from the Decameron from his memory and send them to the capital. He remembered that when he was reading textbooks in his previous life, the authoritative critics had always praised Boccaccio for praising love and advocating social equality and equality between men and women. But after a moment's thought, Fan Xian felt a lingering fear. He remembered that the Decameron contained quite a few dirty jokes. This was a small interlude in Fan Xian's life, but it gave him some sort of spiritual sustenance. It seemed that whether the little girl in the capital was doing well or not had become an indicator of his happiness index. Although Fan Ruoro, who was far away in the capital, was young, she could feel from these letters that her brother, who was far away in Danjo, was different from other children. This pair of brother and sister, whose mental ages differed greatly, continued to write to each other. It was clear that Fan Xian had influenced Ruoro quite a bit. The way she spoke in her letters was much more mature than the average young girl, and her view of the world had begun to change slightly. There were kites in spring, fish in summer, bluebirds in autumn, and geese in winter. Letters came and went, and the days passed just like that. Every time Fan Xian wrote to Ruoro, he would smile bitterly and shake his head. His arm had not been well for the past few years. It was either swollen or painful, as if it was being pricked by needles. Sometimes he could not lift his right hand, so he had to write with his left. When Ruoro, who was in the capital, received the letters, she would marvel at her brother's carefulness, changing his handwriting from one letter to the next. All of this stemmed from that night 6 years ago. After Elder Fei left, little Fan Xian was lonely. One night, he snuck out of the dog hole and arrived outside the strange grocery store that was often closed. He found the back door, took out the key from the thick grass at the bottom of the stone steps, and opened the door. The grocery store was pitch black until Fan Xian arrived at the back door, where a weak oil lamp was lit. Little Fan Xian sniffed, and easily found the millet wine that Wu Zhu had prepared for him. He smiled sweetly, picked up a bowl, and began to drink. Wu Zhu did not drink, and Fan Xian had never even seen him eat, so he was used to it. However, this scene inevitably looked a little absurd. A 6-year-old boy was actually drinking like a heroic ranger in the world. No matter who saw it, they would think that their eyes were playing tricks on them. But Wu Zhu allowed Fan Xian to drink as he pleased, never showing any intention of stopping him. He even began to prepare a few cold dishes for Fan Xian to accompany his drink. Although he was drinking millet wine, drinking too much would still make him feel a little dizzy. Fan Xian squinted his cute little eyes and looked at the expressionless blind man, who seemed to never grow old. "Uncle, why haven't you changed after all these years? It's like you don't age." He then answered his own question. "It seems that the best of the best can stay young forever, but you've never practiced Nigong, have you? Uncle, how many people are there in this world who are truly powerful? How are they ranked? 9th level? Why is it 9 again?" The drunk little boy did not notice the loophole in his own words. "What level are you? No level? What level is that idiot who practiced the Sigu sword in Dongyi? No level either? What level is Yi Luyun, the uncle of so-and-so in the capital? Still no level?" Actually, Fan Xian was answering his own questions. In the end, he laughed and said, "That won't do. I'm going to train to no level too." The blind Wu Zhu's hands were slowly and firmly cutting the radish. His knife was fast, but the blade would retract as soon as it touched the wooden board. His precision was terrifying, and the radish that was cut out looked as if it had been measured with a tool. There was not the slightest difference, and the crystal-clear pieces of radish lay on the chopping board. It was a beautiful sight. Wu Zhu raised his head, hesitated for a moment, then walked to Fan Xian's side and put the kitchen knife in his hand. Chapter 18. That night, Fan Xian stared blankly at the carrots on the chopping board. After digging up graves and dismembering corpses, he began the second part of his life, which was extremely beneficial but also extremely tragic. Sometimes he felt that life was very interesting. Out of nowhere, he had 2 teachers with strange temperaments who did not care about his precocious nature. Furthermore, Fei Jie and Wu Zhu had taught him how to use poison and kill people. The methods they used were quite perverse. Late at night, a very soft tapping sound came from the back room of the grocery store. Wu Zhu turned to the side and said coldly, "I'm cutting very slowly today." Fan Xian wiped the sweat from his forehead and looked at the small mountain of shredded radishes in front of him. He smiled slightly and moved his right arm. He found that after years of training in shredding radishes, his speed was about the same as Wu Zhu's, and the thickness was almost the same. But the swelling in his right arm disappeared and the pain returned. Up to this day, the shredded carrots still made noises. Fan Xian knew that he was still far from Wu Zhu's level of control. Although he did not understand how shredded carrots could help his training in martial arts, when he thought of how Wu Zhu was able to fight against the 4 great grandmasters, Fan Xian felt that the shredded carrots were very tasty. It felt like he was cutting a jazz drum. Of course, the training he received from Wu Zhu was not limited to this. There was also the horse stance and the cliché of climbing cliff. But Wu Zhu's training requirements were too abnormal. He squatted until he could not squat on the toilet, chopped vegetables until his hands cramped, and ran until he could not wake up. The most painful thing was that every 3 days, Wu Zhu would train with him in a remote place outside Danzhou harbor. Or rather, it was the peerless blind Wu Zhu violently beating Fan Xian, an underage child. It was a tragic childhood filled with blood and tears. According to Wu Zhu, this was how the lady had trained her subordinate. Fan Xian was having a headache over these 3 major principles. The so-called 3 major principles referred to, starting from the difficult, strict, and practical requirements, and carrying out large amounts of exercise. In Fan Xian's previous life, this was the most useful method for Chinese athletes to sweep away gold medals. But Fan Xian still did all of this with a shy smile on his face. On the surface, it was because he kept his promise, but in reality, it was because his wisdom far surpassed his age that he knew that all of this would be of great benefit to him. The nameless and domineering Jinqi in his body had become more and more violent in the past few years. Although it was outside of his dantian and contained by the snow mountain at the back of his waist, his undeveloped body still could not withstand the invasion of the Jinqi in his meridians. Often, the Jinqi would overflow, and every time this happened, there would always be furniture around him that would suffer. If he allowed this situation to continue, there would come a day when the speed at which his Jinqi accumulated would exceed the speed at which his meridians matured, causing his body to explode and he would die. What he did not expect was that the blind man Wu Zhu did not have any way to tame the violent Jinqi in his body. All he did was train his body and adjust his bodily functions to an optimal state. Then, he used the method of slicing radishes to train his mind. He was not impatient. Over the years, his control over his Jinqi had become much more stable. When it came to death, none of the living people in this world had as much experience as Fan Xian. Thus, no one was more afraid of death than him and treasured life more. So when he found out that Wu Zhu's training was very helpful in helping him overcome the side effects of the tyrannical scroll, he quietly persevered. Fan Xian thought about it later, and understood the hidden meaning behind Wu Zhu's actions. If the Jinqi was a fire, and he was the furnace, then training his muscles was the same as building a sturdy furnace. Training his mind and spirit was the same as opening a small hole in the furnace, effectively controlling the strength of the fire. As for being hammered by Wu Zhu every day, Fan Xian could only explain it to himself. This was the 3 aspects and 1 great part of the 3 aspects and 1 great. But it really hurt. Early in the morning, Fan Xian woke up in bed. He rubbed his numb eyes and climbed out of bed. He jumped into the servant girl's blanket and sniffed the lingering fragrance of her body. He pursed his lips and was very satisfied. The servant girl, Cici, was combing her hair. Noticing that he had woken up, she smiled and walked over to her bed. She pulled out the boy, who was twisting her blanket like an octopus. She didn't have time to comb her hair, so she just gathered it up and got up to prepare hot water for a morning bath. Fan Xian climbed out of the blanket and sat down on the cotton pillow he had made for Cici. He lifted up his pants and looked inside. He was reciting his favorite drinking game from his previous life, before the onset of the disease. He used his right hand to gesture rock, paper, scissors. Who's lewd? I'm lewd. Who's lewd? You're lewd. He finally raised his eyebrows and looked inside his pant. I'm lewd, he said to himself. You don't have the ability to be lewd. Having been in this world for many years, Fan Xian had long since gotten used to this kind of decadent lifestyle. He yawned as he waited for the servant girl to return. Unexpectedly, after waiting for a long time, he almost fell back to sleep, but there was no hot towel on his face. He didn't know what had happened, but he could hear faint curses coming from the courtyard. Fan Xian put on his clothes and walked out curiously. He immediately saw something that made him very unhappy. In the garden, the visibly tired housekeeper Zhou was fiercely scolding the servant girl, Cici. It seemed that Cici had rushed out to fetch hot water, so her hair was not combed properly and her clothes were not neat. There were a few servant girls surrounding her, their faces full of fear. This housekeeper Zhou had come from the capital 2 years ago. Fan Xian naturally knew that he was sent by his mistress to keep an eye on him. But over the past year, the housekeeper had behaved himself, and Fan Xian had been secretly watching him. He hadn't seen him do anything, so he had always let him be. But today, the housekeeper was scolding his own servant girl. This made Fan Xian very unhappy. He was a very protective person. He narrowed his eyes and walked over to the housekeeper. But for some reason, the housekeeper was particularly stubborn today. He insisted that Cici go to the backyard to be punished. Fan Xian frowned and raised his beautiful face to look at the housekeeper. He laughed. "She's my servant girl. I'll take her back and keep an eye on her." His words seemed very calm, even a little weak. The servant girls around him heard something else and became afraid. They didn't know if the greatest hidden danger in Count Sinan's household, the conflict between the two rooms in the capital and Danzhou, could be suppressed. Chapter 19. For some reason, housekeeper Zhou seemed a little arrogant today. With a fake smile, he said, "Young master, the Countess says I can still manage the affairs of the manor." Housekeeper Zhou had deliberately lengthened the way he addressed Fan Xian, and the disrespect in his tone was obvious. Fan Xian smiled at the contempt in the housekeeper's eyes. Although he had never felt sorry for himself because of his status as an illegitimate child, it was rare to see someone look at him like this, and he couldn't help but feel a little uncomfortable. Seeing that things were not going well, a clever servant girl sneaked away to find the Countess. The other maids and servants were watching the scene nervously. Although there were 2 branches, everyone knew that young Master Fan Xian's status was not very honorable. Moreover, the Danzhou Manor's resources had all come from the capital, from the hands of the second wife. It was because of this that the second wife's trusted aide, housekeeper Zhou, dared to be so disrespectful to the young master. After all, in everyone's minds, the heir to Count Sinan's vast family fortune could only be the young master of the capital, not the adorable 12-year-old before them. Although the servants had always respected and loved Fan Xian, at a time like this, no one dared to take the risk of offending the second wife by taking Fan Xian's side. Only Fan Xian's personal maid, Cici, held Fan Xian's hand tightly. Fan Xian was well aware of the servants' concerns. It was not easy for anyone to live a better life, so he did not feel sad or disappointed. He just tilted his head and looked curiously at the unhappy housekeeper Zhou, wondering why he, who had always been well-behaved, was finally unable to resist. Housekeeper Zhou was the second housekeeper of Count Sinan's manor in the capital. Because he had committed a minor offense in the capital, he had been banished to the remote port of Danzhou. But housekeeper Zhou did not feel that his life had been separated from the prosperity of the capital, nor did he feel sad. Count Sinan's first wife had been dead for many years, and the second wife had given birth to a son 7 years ago. Her status had risen, and her family had some background, so she was on the verge of ascending to the first wife's position. At such a crucial time, Butler Zhou, who was the second wife's confidant, naturally came to Danzhou with ill intentions. In order to complete his task, he carefully managed the count's estate. He was especially respectful to the old madam, and was amiable to the servants. He rarely interfered with other people's work, but every time he saw the little bastard who caused him to be exiled, he couldn't help but reveal his true thoughts. But for some reason, he was a little afraid of the boy who was only in his teens. Because no matter where he went, He seemed to be able to see the boy's smiling face and those clear and transparent eyes. That face was very clean and beautiful, but it would be very strange to find that this face was always by your side after you woke up. When housekeeper Zhou warmly greeted the servants, little Fan Xian's beautiful face was hidden among the flowers, gazing at him in a daze. When housekeeper Zhou furrowed his brows and carefully examined the accounts, little Fan Xian's clean face rested on the windowsill of the accounting room, gazing at him innocently. When housekeeper Zhou respectfully reported to the old madam, little Fan Xian's cute face gently leaned against the old madam's side, gazing at him with endless curiosity. A few months passed like this, and housekeeper Zhou felt that he was going crazy. Regardless of whether he opened or closed his eyes, he could see that clean, cute, and harmless little face. It was like the face of a ghost floating in the white fog. If it wasn't a ghost's face, how could it be so beautiful, and so focused on him? Housekeeper Zhou was almost unable to bear the mental pressure, and even began to feel suspicious. Did the little boy know that he was here to deal with him? But housekeeper Zhou immediately thought, this bastard is so young, how could he know about the treachery of the adult world? But why does he always look at me? Why? Just like in this situation, my words should have made this little bastard feel humiliated, so why can he still smile? Housekeeper Zhou laughed coldly, thinking that the matter in Danzhou was about to end, so why should I be angry at this little bastard? Fan Xian didn't know that his unscrupulous observation of the housekeeper would bring him so much mental pressure. Of course, even if he had known, he wouldn't have felt any more apologetic. He was just curious about what that concubine in the capital would do to deal with him. But seeing housekeeper Zhou use the excuse of teaching his servant girl a lesson to embarrass him, Fan Xian's mood had already begun to become gloomy. After hearing the words, "young master," the smile on his face began to slowly fade. I heard that a few years ago, young master, you chased a servant girl out of the manor. That was too willful. Housekeeper Zhou didn't seem to see the young man's expression change, and continued to speak with a trace of disdain on his face. From now on, young master is still young, so don't worry too much about the affairs of the manor. Fan Xian smiled. Are you warning me to behave? Housekeeper Zhou said he didn't dare, but his tone was arrogant. How could I dare? It's just that before I came, the second mistress said that young master is still young, and that I should look after him. Aren't you afraid that I'll put on my airs as a young master and slap you in the face? Fan Xian asked curiously. Housekeeper Zhou laughed and stroked the thin beard under his chin. Although young master, this one lost his mother when he was young, and has few people to discipline him, but everyone knows that he has been well educated since he was young. How could he treat his servants so harshly? He looked at the handsome young man in front of him, and laughed to himself. A child like this actually wants to put on airs in front of me? Oh! At that moment, Fan Xian seemed to remember that he was an illegitimate child. He came to his senses and turned to leave. Although the servant girls were secretly feeling indignant for the young master, seeing that there was no conflict, they also felt relieved for Fan Xian. Holding Fan Xian's hand, Cici's eyes began to moisten. She thought that the young master was really pitiful, but she was afraid that he would be angry. She stole a glance at Fan Xian out of the corner of her eye and saw that his eyes were full of serenity. Fan Xian took Cici's hand and entered the house. He moved 2 stools to the door and let Cici sit on one, while he moved the other to the garden. The servant girls had not yet dispersed, and housekeeper Zhou was still reminiscing about his heroism. Fan Xian placed the stool in front of housekeeper Zhou. The people around him thought it was strange, and housekeeper Zhou didn't understand. Just as he was about to ask, Fan Xian had already stepped on the stool and stood on it. At that time, Fan Xian was only 12 years old, and he wasn't very tall. With the stool, he was only about as tall as housekeeper Zhou. Everyone was puzzled. They didn't know what he was doing on the stool. At that moment, they saw Fan Xian raise his right hand to his mouth and blow out 2 hot breaths, then raise it high. "What are you doing?" This sentence was still in housekeeper Zhou's mouth, but he didn't have time to spit it out. Fan Xian's little hand had already swung back and slapped forward. Slap! A crisp sound rang out. Housekeeper Zhou was slapped to the ground. A bright red handprint appeared on his face, and a trickle of blood seeped from the corner of his mouth. He was completely stunned. He had never imagined that this child would be so strong, and this child actually dared to hit him. Little Fan Xian jumped down from the stool and rubbed his wrist. He took a handkerchief from a servant girl and wiped his hands. Looking at housekeeper Zhou, who was on the ground covering his face and moaning, Fan Xian said softly, "Even a well-educated person can hit someone. Although I don't mistreat servants, I'm happy to show you what it means to be a spoiled brat." Chapter 20. Housekeeper Zhou fell miserably to the ground. His face was a mess, and he spat out a few pieces of jade. He was still in a semi-conscious state. He looked at Fan Xian powerlessly, his eyes full of fear and shock. Fan Xian said quietly, "I really don't understand what you people are thinking. Do you really think I can't bear to hit you? You seem to have forgotten who you are. Perhaps a well-educated master wouldn't hit a servant, but unfortunately, I hit you. Are you going to hit me back? So I hit you, and you can only accept it. Laugh or go cry to the Countess or the capital, but don't come into the back garden again. I don't like seeing you." Having said this, he dusted off his trousers, turned around and walked up the stairs. He told the dumbfounded Cece that he was going out and left the Count's estate. Behind him, the faces of the maids and servants involuntarily revealed expressions of fear. No one could have imagined that this gentle and lovely boy would have such a violent side. This kind of contrast shocked the hearts of everyone, so they felt especially terrified. At that moment, the Countess also came to the back garden. Seeing the housekeeper lying on the ground in pain, she thought of the child, and couldn't help but smile meaningfully. Last year, he had chased the head servant out of the manor. Today, he had slapped housekeeper Zhou so hard that he didn't know what was going on. The 12-year-old Fan Xian had finally succeeded in establishing some of his authority in the Count's estate. 10 miles west of Danzhou Harbor was a treacherous area with dense reef. The sea breeze blew the blue water in that direction and smashed it into the hard rocks, kicking up a large cloud of snow. On the east side, there was a narrow path that flickered in and out of the strange rock. Fan Xian walked over from that path and turned his body so that his back was facing the ocean. Hearing the deafening sound behind him, he raised his head to look. In front of him was a precipitous cliff. This mountain peak by the sea was born out of thin air, formed by nature. Behind the mountain was a primeval forest and swamp that stretched for hundreds of miles. It was impossible to take a detour to reach the peak. If they wanted to reach the peak, they had to climb up the cliff. Fan Xian glanced at the surface of the cliff and furrowed his brows slightly. In his mind, he immediately found the path he often climbed. However, the wind by the sea had been strong these days. Some of the rocks that had protruded out of the cliff had become loose. If he was going to climb it today, he had to be careful. The waves behind them crashed against the black rocks, but they could not pass through the stone's merciless and cold barrier. They only sent some seawater to the shallows, making the sand here much more humid than in other places. His feet were in the gravel, and the edges of his shoes were wet, making his feet uncomfortable. He took off his shoes and placed them in a clean hole at the bottom of the cliff. He found some dry sand and rubbed it on his palms, then began to adjust the zhenqi in his body. Once he was ready, he placed his right hand firmly on an inconspicuous protrusion on the cliff. Exerting a bit of force, his entire body floated into the air and climbed up lightly. He climbed very quickly, his entire body sticking close to the cliff's surface. He looked like some strange animal that was good at climbing. Every time he stretched out his hand, landed his foot, and exerted force, it seemed very gentle and free. He did not feel that he was using a lot of force. In a short while, he was almost at the top of the cliff. The sea wind around him swirled around him, blowing away the heat and sweat from his body. It made him feel very comfortable. Brother Jing probably didn't climb as fast as I did, but the blind man at the top is much more ruthless than Ma Yu. As Fan Xian climbed, he thought about what had happened in the manor's garden. He felt that things were a bit strange. The second madam's trusted housekeeper had been well behaved for over a year. Why did he make a mistake today and give Fan Xian an opportunity? The sea breeze carried moisture, so the exposed rocks were somewhat slippery. Fan Xian saw that he was about to reach the peak, and his state of mind relaxed. He was also thinking about the matters of his family, so his mind wandered for a moment. His right hand slipped and he almost fell. It seemed dangerous, but Fan Xian did not panic. His left hand was filled with his powerful jinqi, and his 3 fingers tightly gripped the corner of the rock that was the only thing he could use as leverage. His slightly trembling fingers seemed to be deeply embedded in the rock, and could not escape. A wooden stick stretched down from the top of his head, indicating that he should grab it. Fan Xian seemed to want to escape from the stick. Without looking, he swung his body back and pushed off the cliff's surface with the tip of his foot. His whole body borrowed the force to leap up, dangerously close to the top of the mountain. If you're not focused enough, you'll lose your life. On the edge of the cliff, Wu Zhu, dressed in coarse clothing, stood facing the sea wind. His eyes were covered by the black cloth as usual. Fan Xian ignored him and sat down cross-legged. After adjusting himself for a while, he stood up and told Wu Zhu about what had happened at the Count's estate that day, as well as his own doubts. He wanted to get a definitive answer from Wu Zhu. Wu Zhu said coldly, "Do you think your slap would have made the housekeeper restrain himself?" "Yes, as long as my grandmother is on my side." Fan Xian lowered his head. Although he had not used his jinqi just now, the great power that had been hidden in his frail body over the years was truly frightening. Most importantly, the gloomy temperament he had displayed at the time was truly frightening. "Then that's enough." Wu Zhu did not seem to like discussing this issue. "I'm just wondering why the housekeeper would cause trouble today. He has lived in Danzhou harbor with his tail between his legs for a year and a half. Under normal circumstances, there is no reason for him to reveal his true ugly side, unless he feels that he has endured too much, and something is about to happen in Danzhou. In his eyes, I am no longer a threat to the young master in the capital, so there is no need for him to deliberately curry favor with me." Fan Xian's self-deprecating smile appeared on his young face, and it looked very uncoordinated. It was really strange. If Fei Jie had some doubts and fears about Fan Xian's early maturity, then Wu Zhu did not care at all. It seemed that even if Fan Xian had become an old tree demon, as long as he was still Fan Xian, Wu Zhu would not have any reaction. Fan Xian thought that perhaps because Wu Zhu was blind, he could not see the expressions that he often revealed unintentionally, expressions that should not appear on a child's face. Wu Zhu suddenly said, "This is a small matter." Clearly, he felt that Fan Xian's analysis was too serious. "I guess that someone would come to kill me. Is this a small matter?" Fan Xian laughed. Wu Zhu replied coldly, "Fei Jie and I have taught you so much. If you still can't handle a small matter like this, then something big has happened." Fan Xian thought for a moment and accepted this fact. He understood that Wu Zhu would not handle this matter on his behalf. "Let's begin." "Yes." After a long time, in a remote area above the cliff, Fan Xian, bare-chested, moaned pitifully. Again, just as his voice floated out of the cliff, a wooden stick came down from the sky and hit him hard on the back with a dull thud. Chapter 21. At that moment, the powerful Jinqi in Fan Xian's body had already reacted on its own, covering his back in a dense layer. But the wooden stick was too fast, and before the Jinqi could react, all of its power had pierced into his back. The word pierced was used because the stick's owner's attack was like a straight line, and all of the power was concentrated at the tip of the stick. Fan Xian let out a stifled cry of pain. Although his body was protected by Jinqi, the pain still penetrated into his bones, and his whole body curled up. Just a moment ago, he was still curled up on the ground in pain, but the next moment, he used his small hands to push off the stone under his feet, and his whole body rolled up using the momentum of his curled-up body. Then, he fiercely kicked behind him. Anyone who saw a beautiful young man kick out with such a treacherous kick would feel fear. But the only response he got was a simple "pa." Fan Xian half knelt on the ground, his hands rubbing his ankles. He sucked in a breath of cold air, and his eyebrows furrowed in pain. He knew that begging for mercy was useless. This was proven by his experience over the past few years. So, he just stared at the blind man standing 3 meters away and kept calculating in his heart. According to the agreement with him, as long as he hit the blind man, even if it was just the corner of his clothes, he would win. Then, he would get a month's vacation. But after being beaten up for years, Fan Xian had never been able to touch the man's body. On one hand, it was because Wu Zhu's movements were always very ghostly, silent, and fast. What was even more frightening was that his movements came without the slightest warning. It was impossible to predict his movements from the slight tilt of his shoulder or the angle of his peripheral vision. The second reason was the unremarkable wooden stick in Wu Zhu's hand. Every time Fan Xian thought of a way to get close to Wu Zhu's body, the stick would be like the claws of a demon from the netherworld, ruthlessly striking his wrists, ankles, and even his fingers. There was no breaking, only pain, unbearable pain. What puzzled Fan Xian the most was that no matter how hard he tried to muffle his own voice, Wu Zhu was still able to clearly find his position amidst the roar of the waves crashing against the rocks. The stick in his hand never missed its mark. Ayayaya! Another stick struck his wrist, and Fan Xian sang in extreme pain. He sang in a Beijing opera accent, dragging out his voice, far away from the heartless blind man. On the cliff, a nameless little yellow flower bloomed in a cowardly manner. Fan Xian lay weakly on the edge of the cliff. At this time, the sea below the cliff had already recovered its calm. Under the illumination of the sun, a golden light slowly flowed. The rocks that had been washed by the waves finally had some time alone and began to slowly dry. A few crustaceans also climbed up like little black dots. Feeling the pain on his body, he circulated his qi to examine the state of his body. He found that part of the violent Jinqi had been absorbed into the snow mountain behind his waist, and the other part had been used up to resist the constant strikes of the stick. So the Jinqi in his body was in a very calm state, just like the calm sea before him. He knew that resting under these circumstances would not be good for his cultivation, so he resisted the pain and climbed up with difficulty. He sat cross-legged and began to practice the method of the tyrannical scroll. Out of the corner of his eye, he glanced at Wu Zhu, who stood coldly on the edge of the cliff. The black cloth covering Wu Zhu's eyes fluttered in the sea breeze. "He's really cool. He's not pretending to be cool." Fan Xian quietly commented on the blind man in his heart and quietly said, "Uncle, be careful not to fall." Wu Zhu was such a powerful person, and naturally he would not die from falling off a cliff. Fan Xian was just speaking blindly. "Don't get distracted." Wu Zhu threw down these cold words and no longer paid attention to him. Fan Xian sighed in his heart and began to calm his qi and spirit, entering a state of meditation. After an indeterminate amount of time, he awoke amidst the sea breeze and found that the sun in the sky had already shifted its position. Not far from him, Wu Zhu still maintained his steady posture. In the sea breeze, he was like a flag that would never be cut down. He stood up and found that his body had completely recovered. His zhenqi had become more abundant, and the impact on his meridians had weakened. Although his muscles and ankles were still sore, after returning to the manor, he used the medicinal wine he had prepared to rub them down, and they were naturally fine. In the slightly fishy sea breeze, he walked to the edge of the cliff and stood side by side with Wu Zhu, but he was much shorter than Wu Zhu. He picked up a stone and threw it into the sea with all his might. At this time, the zhenqi in his body was vigorous, making him much stronger than the average person. The stone flew far away and landed on the surface of the sea, making a small splash that was barely visible to the naked eye. He was somewhat satisfied with his strength, thinking that even the best martial artists did not have as much arm strength as he did. Looking at the magnificent blue waves in front of him and the free birds flying in the sky, the qi in his body was drawn by the outside world. He couldn't help but feel refreshed. He spread his arms and roared at the surface of the sea. This roar was to vent his depression, to vent his nostalgia for his old world, to vent his love for this world, and to vent the feeling of a trapped beast that he had never had the courage to leave Danzhou. The capital, I will come back one day. Wu Zhu seemed to not hear his roar and continued to stand there quietly. What are you going to do? Fan Xian was stunned. He realized that Wu Zhu, the man of few words, had finally opened his mouth to ask him. He couldn't help but smile and answer, "To see what this world is really like, of course. The outside world is very dangerous," Wu Zhu said coldly, still not turning his head. Fan Xian shrugged his thin shoulders, looking somewhat comical. "I have Uncle Wu Zhu to protect me. What is there to be afraid of? After I came out with the lady, I forgot some things." Wu Zhu's normally calm voice suddenly paused. "So in this world, there are many people who can hurt me, and naturally they can hurt you. Uncle, you are modest." Fan Xian smiled sweetly, thinking that in this still unfamiliar world, he only had one strong bodyguard. If even Wu Zhu wanted to be a shopkeeper who didn't have to do anything, what would he do? "If I were by your side in the capital, I would bring you trouble." Fan Xian raised his head and looked at the blind Wu Zhu's seemingly expressionless face. He thought for a moment, then replied with some embarrassment, "I will protect you." After hearing this, Wu Zhu finally turned his head and very seriously stared into Fan Xian's eyes. The lady also said this. Fan Xian smiled. It seemed that his shamelessness was somewhat like his mother's. Chapter 22. Why do you want to see what this world is like? Wu Zhu seemed to be thinking about something. Where you are standing right now, isn't it part of this world? Fan Xian didn't know how to answer. Since he came from another world, he was naturally interested in many aspects of this world. And the question that had been bothering him for the longest time was, how did he come to this world? 6 years ago, when teacher Fei Jie was still teaching in Danzhou, he had mentioned the temple. At the time, Fan Xian had thought that for him, a dying patient on earth, to become this young man, other than a miracle, what other explanation could there be? So he was very curious about the temple, and wanted to see what was there. As for the capital, it was also a place he wanted to go. He didn't know if Fan Ruoro would be able to live a happy life under the tyranny of her stepmother. And after being separated from Fei Jie for a few years, he also wanted to visit that cute, perverted old man. Most importantly, in his previous life, he had been bedridden for a long time, and in this life, he had been trapped in Danzhou as a child for a long time. In contrast to his current life, a fire began to burn in Fan Xian's heart. This fire was enough to burn his spirit and stimulate his desires. He wanted to do something, to obtain something. Peace and ambition, power and happiness, love and beauty, these were not words that matched, and were even incompatible with each other. They flashed through his mind like floating lights. After thinking for a long time, he carefully replied, "If people only have one life, then they need to see different things and meet different people. Only then can they enjoy the game that can't be repeated." This was Fan Xian's heartfelt words. In his previous life, on his deathbed, he had thought about how he would live his next life if he had another. Wu Zhu asked, "What are your plans?" "First of all, I need to ensure that I can live." Fan Xian crouched down and threw another stone. This time, he didn't use any force, so the stone smashed into the gray reef below. "So I need to have the ability to protect myself. And then I set 3 goals for myself." Wu Zhu listened quietly. "First, I want to have many, many children. Second, I want to write many, many books. Third, I want to live a very, very good life." Fan Xian calmly spoke of such absurd things, without a trace of embarrassment. In the depths of his heart, since this world was not Earth, then he could be considered the only representative of Earthlings in this world. According to biological principles, as the representative of human flesh and blood heritage, he should have the obligation to give birth to many children in this world. At the same time, he believed that he was also the representative of the human cultural heritage on Earth. How many beautiful artistic achievements had human beings created since ancient times? How could they not be found in this world? If he didn't write or copy, he would have there were many, many books that allowed cultural heritages like Chao Shuachin and Kill Bill to shine in this lonely world. He really felt sorry for those lonely sages in the parallel universe. Of course, most importantly, he felt sorry for himself. Naturally, he also regarded himself as the only representative of the humans on Earth to observe this world. Therefore, he had to ensure that he lived a comfortable life. Only in this way could he prolong his life and observe for a few more years. It was not until many years later that Fan Xian shyly admitted to himself that he was merely seeking a great memorial arch for his deeply hidden lust, shamelessness, and greed. On the cliff by the sea, Wu Zhu seemed to need some time to understand what Fan Xian meant by these 3 goals. Calmly, he analyzed, "Then you need to marry many wives, find many poets, and hire many servants." Poets? Fan Xian knew that scholars and poets often use this phrase, but he still did not quite understand. Scholars who specialize in writing manuscripts for others. They don't have the right to sign their names. Fan Xian smiled, thinking that he was prepared to use the likes of old Chao and old Sha as his sharpshooters. Naturally, he did not need those poets. As he was thinking, he heard Wu Zhu's calm and overly simple analysis. If you want to marry many wives, hire many servants, and find many poets, you need to earn a lot of money. If you want to earn a lot of money, you need a lot of power. If you need a lot of power, you need to be closer to the center of power in this country. Wu Zhu turned and left. "When you turn 16, we will return to the capital." Behind him, Fan Xian continued to stand at the edge of the cliff in a daze. He thought to himself that he had only revealed a few of his thoughts that were not too excessive. How could this powerful warrior, who had some mental issues, infer that it was related to the power of a country? And he had so decisively made the decision to return to the capital. Fan Xian naturally remembered that on the day he was born into this world, Wu Zhu had carried him out of the capital. He slapped his face hard to get rid of this feeling of not knowing whether to laugh or cry. He ran to catch up and said with a smile, "Uncle, I've confided in you. Shouldn't you give me something in return?" "What do you want to know?" "About my mother. Why are we being hunted in the capital?" "I will tell you everything about Miss when you turn 16. This is Miss' last will. As for the people who are hunting us, you don't need to know, because they all died 10 years ago." By the time they returned to Danzhou Harbor, it was already noon. Fan Xian and Wu Zhu parted ways outside the city and entered the city alone. The residents of the city had long since become accustomed to the young master of Fan Manor wandering around outside the city. Although there were no large beasts near Donjo, and no dangerous places, some people still felt that the Count's estate did not care about the safety of their illegitimate son. After all, in the eyes of the people, Fan Xian was still a boy of 11 or 12 years old. The residents of Donjo, who had nothing to do all day and did not have to pay taxes to the imperial court, were always so idle that they could infer some very strange ideas from many things. For example, some people in the Count's estate hoped that the illegitimate son would be eaten by strange beasts in the wild, or fall off a cliff and die. Thinking that the little boy, who always had a cute smile on his face, was actually living in such a dangerous mansion, everyone couldn't help but feel some palpitating pleasure. Fan Xian did not know what the passers-by were thinking. He kept his bashful smile on his face, lowered his head, and returned to the Count's estate. Knowing that he would be back for dinner, all the servants were waiting for him. The Countess sat in the armchair, her eyelids half closed, as if she was sleepy. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Nights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.